You will be the first one speaking?
Yes.
And it's Karen?
Karen.
Karen.
Yeah, that's
Is
okay. I
it?
can introduce myself.
Okay. Hello, good morning. Welcome to the, first of all, thank you for being here, you gala dinner survivors. And welcome to the last day of the conference. It's pretty sad, and actually also the weather is sad today. It's gray and raining. But the panelists today will bring the light back to you. Look at that. Yeah, that's nice. So I'm not allowed to introduce them because they're very kind and they will introduce themselves. But I mean, what I love about the session today is the title, actually. The greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. So today we have two amazing communities, Samvera and Dataverse, and we're going to learn about the compassionate actions of their fantastic members. So help me welcome the panelists today, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. This first panel is about Samvera, and we're going to have a panel discussion amongst us. And this is who we are. We're going to introduce each other. We're going to introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about our background and what projects we're working on, and then we're going to go through a series of questions. So I think, should I sit? Should I stand? I'll stand since I'm here. I'm Karen Cariani, Executive Director of the WGBH Media Library and Archives and Project Director for the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. WGBH is a public broadcasting station in Boston. We produce about a third of the material that goes out on the national airs of PBS. And we are a Samvera partner. We've been working in the Samvera community for several years now. We've got a couple projects going on, actually both with Indiana University. One was to build a preservation system using the Samvera stack for audiovisual materials, and the second one is to modify Avalon to use for our tracking our audiovisual materials for the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. And we are doing that in conjunction with AV Preserve, or actually AVP now. And we are a small shop. We don't have very many developers. We have limited resources being public television or public media, but we do believe in the community as a whole. It's just a really great resource for us to tap into. Okay.
Thank you, Karen. Oh, it is hot. I'm Rick Johnson. I'm at the University of Notre Dame. I'm the Director of Digital Initiatives and Scholarship in the Hesburgh Libraries there. And we've been involved with Samvera since 2010, so pretty in the early stages. We actually, I think until at least a few years ago, had code that was running from actually pre-Hydra code, so before the first version of Hydra, and some code that Stanford was generous to let us use while the first Hydra was being baked. So we've been involved with quite a few things over the years, and have gone through a lot of shared projects, as well as just kind of going off on our own as well. Anything else to add, or is that good?
Sounds good.
Right. My name is John Dunn. I am Assistant Dean for Library Technologies at Indiana University Bloomington. And I also serve as co-director of the Avalon Media System project, which we developed jointly with Northwestern University. We've been in the Hydra, now Samvera community since about 2011, 2012, so a little bit more recent than Notre Dame. But we've been involved in open source communities going pretty far back. We got involved with Fedora, actually in the pretty early days back in 2003, also involved in the Sakai library management system development effort back in the mid-2000s as well. We're involved in also in several projects that Karen mentioned jointly with WGBH and kind of moving together with our partners at IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis, toward kind of Hyrax, Samvera, Fedora stack for the bulk of our digital repository services. so a number of kind of touch points with the community. I should also mention I serve on the steering group for the Samvera community.
Thanks, John. I'm Dan Coughlin. I am the Director of Digital Scholarship and Repository Development at the University Libraries at Penn State. We've been involved in the Samvera community around the same time actually as Indiana University, 2011 or 12. I would say that's actually, from the library's perspective, really our first jump into developing within the open source community. It's been really positive for us so far. And our two projects that we've worked on within that have been ScholarSphere, which is our institutional repository. We still actively develop that. And more recently, we've been working on a cultural heritage object repository, which is essentially a content DM replacement. And that's been in development. We've been working on that for under a year, hoping to go into production with that within the year. And then we also have, it's not a Samvera project, but my team works on an electronic thesis and dissertation application. And I mentioned that in the relevance of, it's a project that we work locally on, so we can kind of have this aspect of comparing and contrasting the things that we're doing locally and our own little sort of boutique applications for different partners across the university, and then this larger project that we're working with within the open source community across really the country and internationally.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go to our first question. And our first question is, what challenges have you encountered in working with the community and working with an ever-changing code base? And Dan is going to start us off.
Yeah, so I think our biggest challenge with that is competing priorities. I think everyone can imagine that. That's not particularly disparate from projects that you work on locally as well, right? If you have multiple stakeholders, they're going to have multiple priorities within what they're working on. One of the things that we also have is perhaps within the code base is some different philosophies within different institutions or different people, different developers, particularly around maybe testing, or Penn State puts a real premium on accessibility. So there's some difficulty in there in sort of managing that and what our priorities are with what the community priorities are, and figuring out how to balance that. I would also say the speed at which the community can work at changes, but at times it can go really fast, and that's a challenge for some developers to keep up with at different times. But again, that's not necessarily too different from how the speed of the Rails community may go, but those are probably the two biggest challenges that we have to come with within the code base.
Yeah, before I talk about challenges, I'll just kind of say that the community approach to this type of development has been really tremendous from our point of view, and we could not do what we're doing without the community and without both the people and code we get from that community. That being said, I think we probably all have a lot of the same issues here. I think the speed at which the community and the code base sometimes moves can be challenging, in particular when we're trying to figure out how to connect local development to community development. We have a particular service we're trying to get up and going, kind of what version of hierarchs or underlying kind of code dependencies do we pin it to, which we have to do at a certain point to get the project done. Otherwise, we'll just be constantly playing catch up with the code base rather than delivering service to our users, which is the real goal here. I think that one of the other challenges has been sometimes that there are different, it's a very kind of vibrant, active community, a lot of very, very bright developers and others, and people will have different opinions about how to do something, about how to implement a particular feature, about different opinions about the underlying kind of architecture and the direction that should be going in, and sometimes I mentioned sometimes things go too fast or go fast enough that it can be hard to catch up with, but then sometimes things get slowed down by those discussions, and it's just something that we have to accept in a community like this. I do think there could be more kind of shared functionality, and I'll probably say this a few times in the session, that we work on across the community. More of us have more of the same problems than we have different problems, and so I'd like to see the Samvera community kind of continue to move in that direction of kind of more shared work at all levels of the stack.
Yeah, kind of building upon what John said about all having the same problems. I've always thought similarly about how we're all kind of in the same business of sorts. And when it comes down to it, the needs are not going to be dramatically different. They're, on the edge it's going to change, but the 80% of things are really going to be pretty common. So that's kind of, again, echoing what John said about working with Sambera, is just being able to leverage all of the work that others have done and then build upon that. It has dramatically accelerated us at times, but also when we look to move over to bring things up to current version, that also can take some time. But I think it's just one of those things that is, you just need to do in any case, any kind of system that you're working with, even if you have a vended tool that you are installing locally, there is going to be some migration of some sorts that you will need to do. The benefit of working with the community code is that you just have more control over when and what happens. And in the end, if you do need to break away from the community for a small period and do something that just needs to be done, it's fine. But then you just need to balance that with being ready to come back in the near future so you don't drift too far away.
So I'm probably the smallest shop of anybody on the panel. Again, we're a cultural institution, mostly worried with managing audiovisual materials, and so I have a very small tech staff and dev staff. That said, so our challenges are keeping up with the code and the migrations. But that said, that small group really, really benefits from this larger community and the expertise that exists at all these other institutions. And I have been hiring developers that don't have as much experience with Ruby on Rails and Blacklight and all of the other pieces of the stack, but we have brought them on board. We've sent them to camp, and they get totally engaged with the developers. Thank you guys very much. The developers at all these other institutions, and they get up to speed relatively quickly. And now one of my developers, I think, would be considered one of the stronger ones in the community, possibly. And if anybody steals them, I'm going to get really mad. And that for us is the real benefit of being part of this community. We do sometimes have to delay projects in order to wait for the next release to come on board so that we can jump on the code base at a point when it's a little bit more stable and a little bit more ready. But in the long run, it's just a really big benefit for us in order to be able to tap into that community. So next question. What are the challenges of balancing both local and community needs and the approach to that? And I think I'm starting off this one. And the challenges for us, again, are, so first of all, we were going to define what the difference is between local and community needs. The local needs would be what my institution needs, and the specific code and the specific uses that my institution needs, and the community needs would be having to do with organizing helping with the code base, the core code base, and whether I can give dev time to that core code base. And for us, that's really has been a challenge because we've been so focused on trying to get our own projects up and running and moving along. And I have such a small staff that they don't have a lot of extra time that they can devote to the code base. And I think Samvera as a community just now is really starting to better plan what that roadmap is for that core base so that people can jump in and they can plan a little bit more in advance. So I think right now we're at a turning point where the community adding to that code base is going to be a little bit easier and a little more organized, which is great. And that said, my developers actually did help with this last release of Hyrax, and they were all really happy and felt really proud to do that. And so that was a really great thing for them to be able to do. So what else can I say? I think that was about it for me.
Yeah, so in thinking about how we balance so I think as Karen hinted, historically the code has not moved as much with kind of just common needs, but if someone is available to work on the code, their priorities have in the past, maybe 5 years ago, tended to get more attention. But really in the last year and a half or so, that concerted effort to have more common planning has really allowed folks to jump in to the community sprints. So for example, we've had a developer at Notre Dame that has been involved with Hyrax for a year and a half or so, almost 100% dedicated. And that's really in us looking at the long-term view, saying, what she has worked on has not always been our immediate priority, but it still is contributing to that common sustainability model, and thinking about and the other thing that I really liked about Samvera is that there's various centers of expertise and excellence across the different institutions, and by being part of this, we're able to leverage those different pieces. So even if we're not working on our number one priority at any one point in time, it's very likely someone else is working on that at some point, and then we can leverage that. So it's a bit of it is then also just making sure that we're constantly trying to balance the amount of time we devote to both local and community.
For us at Indiana University, one thing to note is, as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, for us, defining local is even a little complicated sometimes, because we are trying to develop services that work not just for us in the libraries on the Bloomington campus, but to work with partners at IUPUI, our Indianapolis campus, to develop services that work for our 8-campus university as a whole. And so they're, in addition to balancing between kind of local and Samvera community needs, we also are walking a line of balancing between local kind of IU Bloomington research campus needs and the needs of our other campuses. And that's something that's kind of we're figuring out the best way to do that. But in terms of working with the community, a challenge we have, one of the challenges we have is keeping kind of the team of devs up to speed with both what's happening in the community and what's happening locally, and not losing focus of one or the other. Sometimes developers can get so excited about things happening in the community that they get kind of more tied up in those, and then aren't as kind of connected to maybe how needs are changing or projects are changing within the local environment. So that's always something that we kind of need to keep an eye on. In addition, both Rick and Karen mentioned community sprints. These are our kind of efforts that are led by various people and institutions within the Samvera community to kind of gather developers together from multiple institutions to work on a particular feature or underlying component or product to advance it forward. And in the past, couple years, there have sometimes been community sprints that have come up very quickly, where we get an email from someone saying, well, can we provide half a developer or 80% of a developer for this sprint that's starting 2 weeks from now, and we need them for 2 months. And that doesn't really work well with trying to do local planning and make promises locally about when services and upgrades and things are going to be delivered. And I see the community kind of, with some of the changes going on now, moving towards much more, I think, predictability about when those sprints are going to be happening, so that we can plan better kind of how we fit those into our local roadmaps, and see where those fit into the broader kind of Samvera community roadmap, Hyrax roadmap, et cetera.
Yeah, building off actually what John and I think Rick had mentioned earlier, one of the challenges we have is what we're referring to as pinning the code base. So it's a great challenge to have, because it means really the code's always evolving and always moving, but our release cycle doesn't necessarily have the same cadence as the communities. So how we deal with that, and when we decide, okay, it's time for us to stick to this version, we're not going to worry about the additional features that are being added. And how we deal with that isn't really prescriptive. We don't have like all right, 4 weeks before a release or 6 weeks before a release. We don't have anything well defined in that aspect. I mean, it's more of a feel, and it's kind of a feel of meetings with developers and feeling them pulling their hair out and being like, they seem pretty stressed. We're getting closer to the release. Would it be helpful if we pin to this version? And getting their input on that. It's really more of a conversation around that. And when there's a relief of stress from that's about when we typically say, okay, it's time to pin to that version. And then the second sort of issue within that is a bug may come up that we find, and it may be lower in the stack than necessarily what we're working on. And so how we deal with that typically, our approach has been, well, we'll fix it at our layer if we don't have time to fix it at a lower sort of all-in community layer. And what we'll do is we'll document it and provide that documentation to the community. So basically it's a blueprint for how the code can be fixed at a larger scale, but we may not have the ability to fix that. And those are.
So this next question is very similar to the one we just had. It's describe how working on a community project is different from working on a local project, but I think we do have a different angle on it, and Dan's going to start.
Sure. I think the biggest difference that we have is requirements gathering can be a bit more challenging from a community perspective as opposed to some of our local projects where we can get all the partners in a room or stakeholders in a room, talk with them and understand what it is that they want and really, sort of get that continuous feedback loop. But also then within the community, there's really shared opportunities and responsibilities, a lot more communication that happens, a lot more open communication. And I think another really big benefit is there's a lot of opportunity for ownership. A lot of times on local development, we may have developers that's like, we need this thing done, you have time, can you do it? And can you do it maybe more of a something they're being told than requested. Whereas I think within the community, you have a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of things that people would like to have worked on. And if you see something that you're interested in, you're able to, pick that up and run with it. And then within that, there's just a tremendous opportunity for impact as well, right? Something that you're working on that's going to affect, many different institutions as opposed to your local institution is really, I think, a great professional opportunity for some developers.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. Certainly, I think one way in particular in which working on a community effort's different from working locally is that locally usually our projects have pretty clear roles. We know who the developers are, we know who the product owner is, we know who the scrum master is, we know kind of who the subject matter experts who are relevant are, project managers, other roles, kind of who what developer is the expert on maybe a particular piece of technology or particular kind of subpart of the project. And in community efforts, especially when folks don't know each other as well, sometimes those roles can be less clear, or areas of expertise can be less clear. And part of that is then, has to do with kind of confidence of developers and others participating in these efforts to be willing to step up where they see there's a need that needs to be addressed, or a role, or that they have particular expertise that they can bring to bear on a project. That there's a lot of opportunity to be able to step up and take ownership over particular aspects of projects or initiatives, and that can be really exciting for people. I think there's certainly the biggest difference is this shift in mindset of to think about this broader set of community needs and requirements rather than just one's own institution. And I think that might be harder for maybe non-developer roles than for developers, because developers, a lot of developers like working on the code. They like solving these interesting technical problems, and perhaps it doesn't matter as much whether it's IU's problem or someone else's problem. But people in other roles who are used more to thinking, especially those connected very much to users and user needs locally, it is definitely a shift in mindset to start thinking about everyone's needs and how to balance our interests in a particular effort with the broader interests, and how to what to push on and what not with regard to particular requirements and needs that we might have locally that perhaps others don't, or don't have quite the same needs. So I think those are the biggest things I see.
Yeah, and I think at Notre Dame, one of the biggest aspects is constantly trying to find that magical complement between something that's going to really keep the needle moving on addressing some immediate local projects, et cetera, but also making sure that we're contributing to the community projects as well. In terms of the things about that Dan mentioned about it being different with local stakeholders in the room, I think with community projects, we are now blessed with things like Zoom and Hangouts and other services being fairly mature, that then we can actually bring up something up that feels very much like you are in the room with them. And at times I actually prefer sitting at my desk on a Zoom call versus a conference room, because I have easier access to all of my computer and everything, and able to pull things up and share screens very easily, and it just feels really natural. So I think in some respects, the virtual environment has some advantages, but it's those kind of side conversations that may not happen as often, that you really have to be a little bit more deliberate about making sure happen within that. But in terms of the local projects, we of course, our ultimate goal is to serve our local community, but at Notre Dame we also have a focus on really contributing back to the community as a core mission as well. So we're always looking to really serve both of those.
So we had two examples. One was our very first Samvera project, or Hydra project, which was to build a preservation system for audiovisual materials. And it was pretty much a local project that we thought, would be useful to the community as a whole overall. And we struggled, I have to admit, we struggled with that project. We struggled with, because it was happening with the shift of Fedora 3 to Fedora 4. It was happening with a lot of shifts in the code, and we were really dragging in terms of our development. But so that was one example that was hard. Then this current one that we're working on with Indiana University, actually two of them that we've worked on with Indiana University have been much better in terms of keeping together with the community as it's moving forward and making decisions to move to something that's more core to what a community core code would be. So in terms of describing the differences, working on a community code or a community project, you do lose control and you lose a certain amount of decision making, and you need to compromise. And as long as what you get in the end is what you're going to need, that's okay. And I think in some ways that makes you a better person for society, because you're learning how to get along with others and to sort of compromise your needs, or your path, rather, maybe your decision path, not your needs, to join a larger group for the benefit of the larger group, which in the end I think is a better thing. It's also harder to shift gears in the middle of a project if you're working on a community project versus a local project. With a local project, you can suddenly decide to go in another direction. With the community project, it's harder to do that. I would actually say that's a good thing, because often your developers go down rabbit holes because they decide to suddenly shift gears. And I think having a community that's more constraining that is actually really beneficial, in my opinion. So are there any questions from the audience at this point? Yes.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm wondering how many of you have read The Cathedral and the Bazaar? It's a essay written about open source development and things. I think it might help. I would recommend it to the audience as well. The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Let me know if you are interested. I can give you information on it. It's a great piece that talks about, you have this, to give you the background, this person is a developer for kind of standard closed source, and he's thinking how, a lot of software is developed like a cathedral, where you have one or two wizards or mages who are working in secrecy, carving things out and building things, and it's all done kind of behind the scenes. And yet there's the open source way is sort of this bazaar that's broad and wide and cacophony of different ideas and agendas, and yet it still works somehow. It shouldn't in theory, but it does in practice somehow. And he didn't believe it until he tried it. He presented a project and opened it up to the open source, and it worked. Anyway, good suggested reading.
Hi. Sorry, am I on? No? Okay. Thank you, Michaela. So my question is about, we have these great community projects we've been talking about, and you mentioned some of the local projects as well. Do you have any advice or strategies for those who maybe did Samvera or Hydra at a local level and now want to engage? Or as Karen alluded to, they had, like, WGBH's code was localized, but we're hoping the other community could use it. Can you talk a little bit about that path?
Well, I was thinking in particular our FIDO project, where it's code for preservation, managing the technical preservation metadata for audiovisual materials. And Indiana and WGBH developed it together. We have different storage needs on the back end. Indiana University uses an HSM system, and we are putting files on LTO tapes, not manually, but more or less. And so we forked the code at that point. We tried to, as much as possible, to keep the core code the same so that anybody could then pick up that code and use it for their preservation metadata, and then fork at the point depending upon their storage needs. So we built it so that it had asynchronous storage, and at the end you could just sort of path it in the right direction. Did I describe that correctly, John? So that was one example. It's in GitHub, it's there. It's not on Hyrax, but it's still, I think, here, do you want to speak more to that or no? So I think that's one example for us, at least in terms of a local instance.
Yeah, I think another aspect is just being brave enough to share is the biggest thing, where it doesn't have to be, I'm ready to give a formal presentation at a conference, but there's pretty vibrant, Karen knows this, but for the sake of everyone, there's pretty vibrant tech community calls that happen weekly and things like that, and there's probably 15 or 20 working groups active at any point in time, and those are pretty casual and informal and I think pretty welcoming in terms of being ready for ideas. So just, I think the biggest thing is being ready just to participate, and there isn't really any pressure to perform or anything like that once you join a group. It's really being there and listening is fine too. But in terms of thinking about how you can bring forward local work, one of the biggest things is sharing, and if you're able to do a quick demo of something, however formal, then that starts to pique everyone's interest in, hey, that was really cool. How'd you do that? One project I can think of that we have a component called Sippity that is not something that made its way directly into the code without any changes, but a lot of the design and related things, those made their way into the core code, and in many respects then adapted and improved where it then fits with the larger set of sorts. So I think it's being ready to move with things is another aspect, and then also coming back to your own local code and bringing that back up to speed. I know Penn State has done this well in terms of with Sophia, is originally the extraction of Sophia from ScholarSphere, and then doing the work to bring ScholarSphere back up to then incorporating Sophia. So then the code they were doing was the same as communities.
Yeah, I think sharing what you've done via the various channels that are available, finding where the things that others seem to be interested in, and then getting involved in working to bring those into community code where it makes sense is the right strategy. I know one challenge we have sometimes is that the developers and people generally, right, have different personalities and different kind of willingnesses to share, or different fears perhaps about sharing things that they're going to get negative feedback on, which I don't think generally happens within this community. But sometimes developers, particularly newer to the community, can be intimidated by people who are kind of already deeply in the community and have been for some time. And I think that kind of encouragement from within the institution and within the community for people to come up and share and not be afraid of sharing or not be concerned about what kind of feedback they might get. I think that's very important to kind of offer encouragement both at the community and the local institution level for that type of work.
Yeah, that's actually exactly how Scholarsphere, how we developed Scholarsphere, right? We developed this institutional repository locally for our local needs. And then we had discovered, through meeting with people and talking with people on tech calls, that there was a greater need for a lot of the functionality that had been provided through that. So we extracted a lot of that functionality to something that could be used more broadly into Sophia, which is just another Ruby library, essentially. And one of the ways we manage it a little more practically, right, is when you're providing something to the community, it goes back to balancing those local and community needs. We're fortunate that we have a couple developers that can work on things at the same time. So one of the things that we did is, as we were providing something, and extracting it for the community, we continued to build on top of it, right? Which actually helped from a testing standpoint, that something's being built on top of it. But then also we weren't necessarily just spending 4 to 6 months with a release that had no impact on our users, right? So we had this release, and it was really Scholarsphere on top of Sophia, and it had these other great things that you have all been asking for, right? And that's something that I think is important in terms of balancing that, to make sure that you are still providing something that your local university finds value in as well.
I'm going to answer the question in a little bit different way, which is the opportunities that you have in the Samvera community to share your work and to connect with other folks in the community. There are monthly partner calls where you can bring up your projects and you can talk to folks about what you're doing, so that if other people have like needs, you can then connect with them. There is an annual meeting called Samvera Connect, which is going to happen in Utah in October. And you can go to the website to find information about that. And that's when people come together face to face to present their projects and to talk about the community in general and how the community is going. And again, to connect to other folks who have similar needs and similar projects going on that you might want to work together on. There's a virtual Connect, which is halfway through the year. It's happening July 11th, I think. It's a on 2-hour meeting, 3-hour meeting on your computer. You could connect in to sort of figure out what was going on halfway between the year. So there are lots of ways, the working groups, the interest groups, there are lots of ways to share what you're doing that might be of interest to somebody else, or find out what somebody else is doing that might be of interest to you. And it really is the core of, we've all kind of got the same problems that we're trying to solve, so how can we solve these problems together? Because they're big problems, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to go it alone, in my opinion. But okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. So if you guys are okay, a lot of these questions are kind of similar. We only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to jump to this one. What are the most valuable attributes for each of us in the Samvera community? Is that okay? And if we can roll into that too, what is the sustainable model for the community? Can we do both of those all at once? Okay. So again, we've sort of been reiterating about the value of the community in terms of there's training opportunities to get your developers up to speed. That's a great opportunity also for them to have face-to-face time with other developers, so that it's a familiar voice on the phone, it's a familiar person that they can meet up with at conferences, and it really does become a friendship of sorts. And the developers really enjoy working together. My developers had been working kind of on our own material, on our own code and our own projects at GBH, and recently they've sort of more opened up into the community, and they love it. They just love working with other people, being able to tap into that expertise. They are learning, they're contributing, and it just feels really good. And in terms of the sustainability, for us, again, we're a small shop, and I look to these academic institutions that are not going to go away. You know, they're always going to be there, and they're always going to care about their libraries and their library systems. So I'm feeling like I can depend on the fact that things that they build are going to be there, and they're going to continue to use them, and I can utilize that. As opposed to a vendor solution, which after 3 to 5 years, they're going to shift gears or go away or whatever. We've been there.
Okay, so I'll try to be quick. In terms of benefits, I think one of the biggest things that we're really looking to start to realize is by having a lot of community effort on a lot of the common needs that then theoretically frees up more time to work on more of the specialized projects that are the things that you really want to spend the most time on or are going to provide the most value, et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of sustainability, one of the biggest things that I think we're very blessed with in Samvera is we have historically had an influx of at least 3 or 4 institutions, new institutions per year to come into the project. And that brings new energy, new muscle of sorts, so that there always seems to be a constant flux. So as the priorities really fluctuate locally in terms of when you can devote more time versus others to a community project, a lot of that gap is covered by having so many institutions involved.
Rather than repeat things that people have already said, I'll just add in terms of benefit of community participation to us locally. Another benefit I'll mention actually is it helps me justify resources. So when I can, when I'm in a community where it's clear kind of what level of effort that other institutions are devoting to their local and to community development work around repositories, that helps me. You know, maybe it doesn't help so much if I say, well, Stanford's doing this. That's not a good argument to my dean in a public state university. But if I say, well, Penn State's doing this, and Michigan's doing that, and so forth, that actually helps me in terms of justifying adequate resources to devote to repository activities. And sustainability, the one thing I'll add there is I think that everything that Rick said about the growth and of the community and people coming in and adding new resources is true. The community, though, is getting to a point where it's kind of big enough that some more kind of support and infrastructural apparatus and staffing is needed, and that's going to be a kind of change for the community, but I think an exciting one as we look at kind of more kind of ongoing shared roles within the community to support technical and community management. So more to come on that.
Yeah, and I would say the people are certainly our most valuable aspect, that we get to work with a really smart group of people, really generous with their time. We're not solving our problems in a vacuum, which is, for me, great. We've seen, I'm sure, right, a lot of local projects that someone works on within their own workspace for 10 years, and then they go on and no one else knows how to use it. This really, we have more shared information and shared knowledge. And I've seen a lot of professional development opportunities for folks as well, from presenting at conferences to also just, you see developers like Karen had mentioned that come in sort of beginners or newbies, you know, to whether it's to Rails or to the Samvera stack, and you see them grow, right, which is really, really cool. And I've never been a part of a community that's been so open to that kind of growth for the developers and really helping them come along. And the sustainability model, I would just mention, because we have about 10 seconds, it's maturing and in a very positive way from my perspective.
Are there any other questions from the audience? We have 1 minute for questions. So there you are.
So we've talked a lot about developers in the community, and I wonder if each person could just briefly share other ways that your institution contributes resources to the community, because I think there is a real difference about the communities that we work in, that it's community driven, but it's also more than just about development and management.
So we're running shortly on time, so I'm going to, you've heard about the code and the development contributions. For me, I help with my opinion as a manager, with my opinion in terms of helping the community move forward, with communication and marketing. So there's lots of other ways that you can contribute back to the community that's not necessarily code development. Just helping the community mature, helping it move forward. Often, you know, the perspective from a non-developer in terms of what's going on with projects and how projects are moving forward and how that helps the community as a whole is important voice to have, and it's an important voice to speak up. So I think I hope that answers what you were trying to say. So there's lots of opportunities to contribute without just contributing code. Okay. So we're done. We're done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also for being on time. So the second panelists are going to talk about another great community, which is Dataverse. I don't know if you hear me. Yeah, I was impressed to read in the abstract that just in 2017 you basically double your community and the installations around the world. I'm very curious to learn how you did that. Again, I'm not allowed to say their names. I don't know, it's a secret. So they're going to introduce themselves, and they're our 6 panelists, so please join me to welcome them on stage. Oh, wow, I got it. Thank you. That's going to be impossible, I guess.
All right. Thank you for coming. My name is Sherry Lake. I am the keeper of the Dataverse at the University of Virginia, and I'm the wrangler of this panel. The Dataverse project is an open source application for publishing, referencing, extracting, and analyzing research data. The main goal of the project is to solve the problems of data sharing through building technologies that enable institutions to reduce the burdens for researchers and data publishers and incentivize them to share their data. For over 10 years, the Dataverse community has been collaboratively building repository software to allow researchers to share, publish, find their data. Researchers can use a repository hosted locally at Harvard with their data sets. Institutions can also install local versions for Dataverse for researchers at their own institutions. Publishers and journals can take advantage of the journal data submission system, such as the Open Journal system. There are many ways to contribute to the Dataverse project. The Dataverse development community is an active group of internal and external contributors to the Dataverse software code base. All documentation and code is available and open to all. Source code is on GitHub, when issues are tracked, and release roadmaps are documented on Waffleboard. There are guides for users, developers, administrators. Some of it has been community generated and pushed out. There are many ways one can participate in the Dataverse community, and you'll see by our panelists up here the many different ways. There are currently 33 production installations of Dataverse, ranging from a single institution, like the University of Virginia, to state consortia, like the Texas Data Repository, to Dataverses at the national levels. Telling their stories today, we have Gustavo Duran, IQSS, at Harvard University, the home of Dataverse. We have Courtney Muma, Deputy Director of the Texas Digital Library. Leah Vanderyacht, University of Alberta, representing Canada Dataverse North. We have Janet McDougall, Senior Archivist at the Australian Data Archive, Australian National University, and Obi Odu, the Arctic University of Norway, representing Dataverse Norway. Take it away, Gustavo.
So, yes, so I'm Gustavo Durand. I'm the tech lead and architect on the Dataverse project. And so in that role, one of my primary tasks is to help steer different contributions from the community to get them into the core area of the code. So I'm going to mostly focus on that in my few slides. Sherry already basically described what Dataverse is and the fact that we've been working on it for 10 years, over 10 years now at Harvard. In particular, our funding comes partially from Harvard, and then the rest of it comes from grants and collaborations that we work with these different groups. At Harvard itself, we have about 15 people on the core team, and that includes my role, Danny as a project manager, the designers, the developers, the curation staff. But what's exciting is that we have a more robust community outside of just what we have at Harvard. We've so far had over 60 different code contributors outside of the core team contribute. And beyond that, we have hundreds of members of the community, which includes not just the developers and the technical people, but also the users of the software, the researchers, the librarians, and the data scientists. We have several different channels for which we communicate with the community. And so we have a Google group mailing list, which is fairly active. And one thing that's nice is as we've seen the community grow, originally when questions would come in, we'd be the ones to respond. But now as questions come in, before we're even able to fully process what was written, someone else from the community has come in and has a great answer, and a great discussion follows on those conversations. We also do bi-weekly community calls, which we currently are hosting, and where we make announcements about new releases and new functionality that's being worked on by the core team. But generally, we open it up to questions from the community and just, again, have nice, vibrant discussions about what the community's interests are. And we also host an annual Dataverse community meeting at Harvard itself, which is actually next week. So if you're able to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts and are interested, June 13th, 14th, and 15th next week. And recently, a global Dataverse community consortium has been started. And the idea there is to provide services and that could be useful to all the different Dataverse installations across the community. The initial service that's being provided is membership for DataSite to make it more easy for different installations to mint their DOIs. But we are considering other future services, things that range from maybe providing global support or curation help to just basically being able to connect different organizations and groups together to be able to work on projects that they find interesting and useful. Sherry already mentioned we have 33 installations currently around the world. Here's a picture from last year's community meeting. You can see we're a fun group of people. And so things that are important when you want to contribute, and especially from the code perspective, into the core project, is understanding our development process. And so this is the waffle board that Sherry mentioned. And basically it just tracks issues as they come in from us or from the community or for anyone through the inbox, and how we bring it into a sprint, and then we start to develop on it. We go through code review, go through QA. And we do this not just for the internal issues that we work on, but also when a pull request is made by a contributor, we bring it into the code review. Danny and I basically review it, see if it's something simple and straightforward we can work on immediately, or if it's going to be something that's a little more involved, we might push it back to the next sprint, next sprint column to work on in basically the following 2 weeks. Our technology is basically a standard web app, so we run on Glassfish Server 4, which is the open source implementation from Oracle, and we use Java SE8 and Java EE8, which is the enterprise edition, a lot of different modules at all the levels. Our storage, we use Postgres for our database, we use Solr for indexing and search, and then we can store our files either on a file system connected to the server, or Swift in OpenStack, or we also now support Amazon S3, which is how we run it at Harvard. So to encourage the community to contribute code, one of the main things we do is we try to operate with outside developers the same as we do with internal developers. And so a couple general concepts that we do internally on the team is we make sure that we don't just wait till the code is ready and written and review it at the end, but we make sure we talk early and we preview what's being worked on, and we basically help design with the internal developers. And so we encourage always the contributions from outside to talk to us early. Let's get in front of it, and let's not wait till the pull request is made to have our first view of what it is that's being worked on. We also like to work in small batches. It's usually much easier to review the code and to get it through QA and deal with merge conflicts from all the other issues. So we encourage outside groups to also try to work in small batches as well. But obviously, a lot of the times, some of the tasks that they're interested in developing are going to be these larger tasks. And so we'll work with the groups as need be and as can be done. There are basically 3 general areas in the code that we work with. The core code itself, which is the application as it's run. Modular components, which are basically components that run in the same environment as the core code, but don't necessarily need to be distributed with the core. And then external tools where that call our APIs either to help get data in or call the APIs to be able to do things with the data afterwards. And we have hooks in the code to be able to connect to these external tools. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we provide several references for outside groups and inside groups as well. But there's a guide for developers, there's a style guide if you're working on more UI-related issues, and there's an API guide to tell you all about the different APIs that your tools can call. So I'm just going to go quickly through some examples of some of the collaborations, but very briefly, tomorrow actually we're also not tomorrow, today at 11 o'clock we're also in the repository rodeo, and some of these will be talked a little more in depth by Danny then. So make sure you stay in this room for 11 o'clock. But so we've had contributions for core stuff from a group at the Harvard Medical School to work on big data transfer and multiple storage locations with Mass Open Cloud for dealing with the storage of that data, and that be able to provide compute access. And then we've also been working with the Australia Data Archive to enhance the request access workflow that we initially developed at Harvard, but they've made some great suggestions and improvements on how that should work to get more information from the users up front. I talked a little bit about the modular components, and so a couple areas that we have at modular is to be able to decide what your persistent ID provider was. And so for Harvard, what was useful was to have DOIs through DataSite, but there were other groups that wanted handle support, and so they contributed code to help make that area more modular, and then actually the actual code that does the communication with handles. And then the For Science group very recently added, and is adding, I think it's in code review right now, or QA, but basically our exports having an open air compliant export capability. And then some of the external tools, we've worked with Scholars Portal in Canada to provide links and hooks to a data explorer tool. What we call it Modular Explorer. So basically anyone who wants to explore data can create a tool, and it's very easy to add it into a running Dataverse installation to connect to that application. And so they've made a wonderful project out of Scholars Portal there. We also have an idea of being able to configure things modularly, and so we're working with the Schools of Engineering and Applied Science at Harvard to work on this tool called Psi, which is for differential privacy. And then an interesting project, there's a group called Research Space, which is eLab notebooks, and they wanted to hook up to our APIs, and they did. But then in addition, they also provided a client library to work for Java back to the community. So it's not just their wrapper around our APIs, but now anyone who wants to write an application using Java and calling our APIs has that library to use. So that's it for me. Again, next week, 13, 14, and 15 is a community meeting, and I think Courtney's next.
Howdy, folks. I'm Courtney from the Texas Digital Library, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Texas Data Repository. For those of you who aren't yet familiar, the Texas Digital Library is a consortium of Texas higher education institutions that builds capacity for preserving, managing, and providing access to unique digital collections of enduring value. We started the Texas Data Repository. It's been in production since January of sorry, this should be 2017. January of 2017. And I actually started at the Texas Digital Library as manager of the Texas Data Repository in February of 2017, just after we had launched, really. We started actually with a pilot of 6 of the 22 TDL members. That quickly expanded by the time I started to 9 users of our production Dataverse repository, and now we're at 11 institutional Dataverses, so half of our TDL membership is currently using the Texas Data Repository, which is the fastest we've ever seen any of our projects grow at TDL. We've got hundreds of published Dataverses and datasets already. And one of the biggest and most significant developments in the first year of the TDR is we created a TDR steering committee, which basically it consists of myself as the manager of the TDR and now as deputy director of TDL. one liaison representative from each of the institutional dataverses. So there are 11 folks other than me who are on the TDR steering committee. We wrote a charter and figured out our own governance. We have a chair and a vice chair that rotate on an annual basis. So we've just changed to our second chair as of the TCDL conference in Texas. And we also spun up from that TDR steering committee 2 working groups in the first year, one on training and outreach and the other one on assessment. So some highlights from our first year, really again, is this Texas Digital Library Management Partnership with the TDR Steering Committee and also with the Dataverse community. So the way it works is that the TDR Steering Committee reports kind of to TDL about the needs of each of the 11 institutions who are running their own institutional dataverse within the Texas Data Repository. And then we work up to the Dataverse community. I represent kind of as a liaison to the TDR, to the Dataverse community, and join those wonderful community calls that Gustavo mentioned. And I participate in contributing issues to the GitHub, and also frequently write emails asking for help to the very active Dataverse community listserv. And I get it every time I ask, and usually really quickly. Another thing about year one is we have significantly increased the capacity to support data management in Texas. We already had solutions at a lot of the larger institutions in Texas for larger sets of data, but we're looking at the long tail here. And for all the institutions who have decided to join the TDR, they all report increased capacity. We also see increased collaboration across the member institutions, even beyond the TDR steering committee. We see many of our liaison members getting together and presenting at conferences about their own implementations, about their outreach strategies, about how they're looking to do assessment projects and that sort of thing. We've also worked together on really great, robust new documentation for TDR, which has been really significant. I mentioned the Dataverse community participation and contributions, but again, I just really want to give shouts to that community because for such a new community and one that's only decided to start a global community consortium, even without that consortium, the community has been extremely active and extremely helpful, led again by Harvard and IQSS. And one thing I also want to point out is because of the APIs that Dataverse has, our own developer at the Texas Data Repository, Nicholas Woodward, who's in the back there, waving, he was able to create some really great reports for each of our liaisons so that they get every 2 weeks pretty robust reports about the use of their data repository. And then I, of course, get a report about the whole thing. We've also, because of some improvements to Dataverse in the last year, they enabled Google OAuth authentication. So we only had Shibboleth at first, so each of the institutions, only researchers using their own Shibboleth logins could access the data repository. And because of the work that Dataverse did to expand to Google OAuth authorization, we were able to implement that in Texas, and now we are just about to go live so that outside researchers can participate in research activities with researchers at each of the institutions. Just a little bit too about our roadmap. There are still challenges in the Dataverse community. Again, we're relatively new. The community itself is new, the software itself is rather new, and then TDR is only almost 2 years old. So we want to look at ways to deal with bigger data. One part of that is that this summer we will be shifting over to the same kind of S3 implementation that they have at Harvard right now. We want to do more work around bulk import, which we know we can do using the APIs, but we just haven't had the developer resources to do that yet. We want to develop support for PII, and we know that that's coming from the Dataverse team very soon. The TDR steering committee in particular is really interested in doing mass collective outreach. In the first year, our training and outreach group put together quite a lot of tools and documentation and training materials, and we shared a lot of our resources. But there are still some institutions as part of the TDR who are at risk and who may pull out of the TDR because they haven't been able to get researcher buy-in. So we have decided that together as the TDR steering committee, we are going to reach out en masse and try to do a massive research outreach effort this year so that we don't lose those folks who didn't have immediate successes. Part of that is doing a researcher assessment, which we plan to do on each of our campuses in the next few months, so it's going to be a rapid turnaround, hopefully. We're starting a series of webinars to help folks and creating new training modules internally. We hosted a data symposium a couple of years ago when we were first implementing the TDR, but we're going to do a second one in the coming year, inviting people from all over Texas and hopefully also inviting speakers from the larger Dataverse community to help us. And then finally, we're working on outreach to specific disciplinary conferences in Texas. So we need to go to conferences that are not library conferences or archives conferences. We need to go specifically to especially humanities disciplinary conferences to let them know that we exist and we're there to help them.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Leah Vandriot from the University of Alberta, and I'm representing a group called Dataverse North. I'd like to particularly acknowledge Eugene Barsky, amazing data librarian from the University of British Columbia, who worked with me to put this talk together. And what I hope to do is just give you an overview of how we're approaching Dataverse kind of from a national perspective and a real collaborative perspective. So just to maybe situate Dataverse North within kind of broader things that are happening with data in Canada, research data. So it's a Dataverse North working group that is connected to a very, very important research data management and data archiving initiative called Portage, which has support from all kinds of sectors and all sorts of parties at different universities, but particularly the Canadian Association of Research Libraries. So these are Canadian members of ARL. So, you know, more than a dozen, probably up to around 20 large universities in Canada. So the goal of the Portage Network, it's been underway for about 3 years, is threefold: to build a community of practice for research data management. So help people who are working with particular kinds of data to connect with one another and share their expertise with one another. So serving as that connecting agent. Very importantly, to engage with and advocate for research data management with stakeholder communities. So that's talking to VP research offices, that's talking to our funding agencies in Canada, that's talking to our federal government to advocate for better funding for digital infrastructure in Canada, relating to research data. And I mean, research data is exploding, and that's not actually a very hard argument to make. And recently there's been an announcement of an extremely large funding envelope for that. And we want to, of course, facilitate and provide leadership in the development of RDM infrastructure in Canada. And so there is a repository called the Federated Research Data Repository in limited production right now that will be able to handle big data. Portage has built a huge network of experts. Huge meaning like Canada huge, I guess. We do so for a population of 35 million people, we have 110 really, really great experts in data work, data creation, management, preservation training, research and analysis. There are more than 40 organizations formally affiliated with Portage, and the working groups are we are one of the working groups in Portage. We're looking at institutional strategies, ethical treatment of sensitive data, again, the service model for the big data repository, and then there's us, Dataverse North. One thing I'd like to just note, if anybody else is sort of from a country that's very, very, very large and like really dispersed, and it's, maybe it costs just as much. Like it cost me, I live in Western Canada, and it cost me the same amount of money to fly to Eastern Canada as it does for me to fly like to London, England. So it's really hard for us in Canada to kind of get together really often. So we tend to try to work in a regional way. We use our regional consortia to organize our training and work together and kind of implement like national strategies at a local level. So that's kind of a structure that's extremely important to us and has actually been very fruitful to us in other research data related things, such as data training for data librarians and train the trainer sorts of activities. And of course, Dataverse North is part of a larger RDM ecosystem, including things like high performance computing organizations, CASRE, which is a research standards organization, our funding agencies, Research Data Canada, which is yet another organization focusing more a little bit on the high performance computing side of things. So Dataverse North is fairly new, so I'm just going to report on what we've been able to work through over the last year. So we broke out into 3 subgroups. One is called business models, one's called metadata, and one's the training group. And that's just, really came out of the members of the Dataverse community saying, like, what's in front of us right now, what seems to be the big priority. Broke out some terms of reference. People volunteered to work on the various working groups. And then every group agreed to, in the first year, to put together some milestones so that we could really have some outcomes we could point to for our community building activities. So we're trying to be deliberate and about actually structuring our community work together. So that it's not all organic, it's also has some formality and structure to it, which I think is very useful. So this is just a timeline for each group in terms of what everyone was expected to do and recommend at the end of the year at the next CARL directors meeting. So the first recommendation from the business models group was actually just to establish one national Dataverse North service hosted by Scholars Portal. Scholars Portal is like an organization which has many different universities working together to deliver shared digital services in the digital scholarship domain. So while large universities like mine at the University of Alberta are running our own Dataverse instances, there are so many institutions that, and we've heard this throughout the conference, right? Like smaller institutions that don't necessarily have the resources to have their own Dataverse, but have researchers who need to archive data. So this is a key recommendation that has come from our group, and so it's just at the recommendation stage. I don't have any implementation timelines for you, but we're working through everything that would need to be in place to establish the governance structure around such an initiative. Our metadata groups, looking at some of the things that are kind of unfolding with metadata in Dataverse as we see researchers using Dataverse and kind of finding their own way through it, is thinking about a base metadata template for Dataverse repositories using standard vocabularies and identifiers. And it could be standard vocabularies that pertain to a particular research area, but just really starting to engage with that sort of addressing of real researcher needs. And also there's sort of I wouldn't describe it as chaos, but there's a lot of variation in the way that people are just basic RDM concepts of file naming, labeling, organizing everything. We can really help by just providing some good recommendations to people around those RDM concepts and at the outset. And we want to do that now, right? We want to do that at the beginning. Our training group, well, it's kind of funny. Of course, our training group recommends that training is very important, but it is really important at the outset right now. There's also our 3 major funding agencies have just announced research data management related policy for funded research in Canada. And so we expect that we are going to have many, many training requests come to us at all of our universities. So we want to work together within the Dataverse Dataverse North community on just multimodal training, like just delivering training in whatever way we possibly can, from like in-person to webinars to like everything in between. And well, we're librarians. We've all actually created a ton of training around Dataverse. So this is kind of about a wrangling and gathering together and standardization exercise. That's all I had from my side on Dataverse North, and I'd be happy to answer questions at the end of the panel.
Good morning, folks. This is the story of the Australian Data Archive and Dataverse, and without giving my story away, it's actually been a very good experience to date. And I'm Janet McDougall, and I'm representing my colleagues that aren't here. So basically, in brief, we started in 1981, modelled probably on the UK Data Archive and ICPSR. The fact that we've survived all these years when data wasn't cool and no one considered how expensive it was to collect and keep, I think that's quite a miracle. We hold over 6,000 data sets and around 1,500, within 1,500 projects, but this is highly curated and highly managed data, so there's no open data here at the moment with us. And we get our data from academic, government and private sectors. You can have a quick squiz. We have a lot of really interesting data ranging from the 1800 census to present, and occasionally when you curate, you sort of get a bit caught down that rabbit hole. On a mission, well, we started with, when I started 8 years ago, we were in Nestar, and that is a proprietary system, which several years ago they stopped developing. So we were in a bit of a pickle. Our VMs were sort of outgrowing our system, and we were sort of looking around. There wasn't a lot available, but we got to crisis point, and we started noticing Dataverse was maturing, and they were putting out a roadmap, so we felt that we could have an idea of where they were going. So we said, all right, mission time, new functionality, what do we want? So we want self-deposit. We want to be able to enable researchers to have less curated data, but still have it of quality standard. We want open data access, APIs, so that data can come in and out, and R is sort of becoming a very popular tool. When we started 18 months ago, Shibboleth and Orchid were going, so I haven't looked to the future yet on that. Our requirements in a package, we wanted open source and we wanted community standards. We wanted a tool that could also enable restricted and open access, as restricted is very important for our managed collections. And we wanted an active user and developer community, because we'd been in that spot where Nestar stopped and there was nothing we could do. We were just locked in, and it was getting quite desperate where we were going to go with that. So also we wanted customization and out of the box. So we wanted to be able to install something straight up for some users, but we wanted to be able to do our own thing. So we reviewed Dataverse, NADA or NADA, and CCAN. Obviously we chose Dataverse, and why? Well, they had a variety of platforms you could install on, login options. As we've just heard, there are more now. API and GUI access, a bunch of really relevant client libraries, harvesting, and once again, I'm sort of really pushing on this open and restricted data access. And in that, we also want to, we've been curating data on the OAIS model for many, many years, but this is a manual process. Although the processing of the data is syntactical, if that's such a word, we want to actually move the whole preservation process to an automated mode in the future, and that may well be based on our implementing Dataverse. So we started, 18 months ago, we started doing our reviews. We chose Dataverse, and in February, we started detailed testing. So we looked at how we could migrate between Dataverse and Nestar and Dataverse, and that wasn't exactly a clean move, but between the Nestar APIs and Dataverse, our developers managed to set up some automated code for that, and that's actually in progress now. DDI metadata support, pretty close, so we haven't really had any trouble with that. And being about the community, the Dataverse community has been so supportive, and as Gustavo said, you put up a question and there'll be dozens of answers from all over the place, and I'd actually like to formalise some more of the Nestar groups moving with that in the future. So May, July last year, we set up production environment and we started publishing all our new data straight into Dataverse. And some of our major collections, some of the archivists did manual migration, which wasn't that onerous, although I didn't do any, so easy for me to say. Then in August, we did an initial soft launch, and that went successfully, nice and gently, no problems. And in the interim between July and October last year, our developer customized some code for one of our new major clients, which is a really great win for the archive to be able to archive these really valuable Australian data sets from the Australian government. Then December last year, we went the hard launch. I think we had a party, I can't remember in all the chaos. But yeah, so that went successfully. We've actually had no issues. We've been operating as a Dataverse site, and we've had great responses from users applying for the highly restricted data. They're in shock. Its turnaround is a day, and yeah, they're really loving it. And this month, we're moving our full archive over. These are the metrics I've been told for what time was spent on Dataverse. Feels like a little bit more, but there you go. And here we are. This is our live Dataverse snapshot yesterday. Yeah, and we're really, really pleased community dwellers. Thank you.
Push down. Okay. Can I expand? Thank you. I will be talking about what we have done in University of Tromsø or Arctic University of Norway. We have done a national and generic research data infrastructure for the whole Norway. Let's see. Can you hear me? Okay. Wait. Just... Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll start again. I will be talking about how a subject-based data repository was turned into a generic research data infrastructure and service in Norway. My name is Obiaju Lodu. I'm coming from the Arctic University of Norway. And we launched what we call Dataverse NO in 2017. And the researchers from participating institutions and the non-participating institutions can use our infrastructure. And each partner institution administered its own archive in Dataverse NO. The Arctic University of Norway is responsible for the development and maintenance of the technical platform. I will have some background. In 2014, we created a subject-based repository based on Dataverse, and it was for the Tromsø repository of language and linguistics, we called it trolling. In 2016, we decided to create a repository for the whole institution, the whole university. And trolling became a part of the database. And in 2017, we decided to make database great in Norway, or make it greater again. And we decided to build an infrastructure for the whole country. Why, you should ask why database NO? This is because the university library has a long history of working with research data. And we were approached by other universities showing their interest on the possibility of joining us. And they do not want to establish their own database, probably because it might cost them or it will take them a long time to do that. And UIT decided to build a top-level database, and all the institutions will be on the sub-level database. And the first university to join is called the University of Agder. They joined in 2017. And the other institutions has indicated their interest in joining that database. The policy is determined by the database board. And the organization encourages researchers to make their digital research data and related outputs findable. That is fair. The organization provides and advise services and short-term data management and long-term archiving. We participate in both national and international projects and the network and research. Database NO is funded by membership from a partner institution and the UIT as the owner. The organization, the data management is in the hands of each partner institution. Each institution provides access to the services, facilities, and support needed to allow their researchers to comply with their policy. Database NO manages the network. We were influenced by the work done by Database Netherlands and others. The role in our database, the roles are divided into the roles and responsibilities into 4 categories. And we have the research staff and the students uploading and depositing their data sets into database NO. And the library mainly curates and arranges training and workshops. And we have the IT department. Basically, what they do is taking care of the backup and seeing that the system is not hacked. That is security. And we have the Department of Research and Development. What they do is to give legal advice to database NO. If you look here, you can see structure at a participating university, how it looks. What happened is that the library supports and trains researchers in data management plan. And the researchers and the students deposit their data sets into our repository. And the library has also a backup, call it a backup office, where you can ring or send email to them to answer questions. Database NO is working on complying with the core trustworthy data repository requirements. I will not say or state the requirements, but we are sending an application this month to a core trust seal. I'll say a little about training. Database NO offers continuous training packages support and knowledge exchange to UIT students and staff, and super users at other participating institutions. And we have created websites, and several guidelines are there to help our users. Yes, we have some challenges, and some of them are the possibility to select a license from a list of predefined licenses, and the possibility also to choose a landing page. Like if I'm from an institution, and when first time I log in, I will not be at the home page, but I will be at the home page of the institution or sub-database. And we have technical issues. We have some, and one of them is that we are trying to create a trigger function that automatically assigns a user to a particular group. What next? We want advanced statistics and the metric reporting. And we would like integration between open journal system and the database. And we are looking at long-term preservation and database scaling. And also we are looking at the next generation of authentication. And these are our full team at the university. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for the panelists. I think, we have a coffee break, but if there's any question here, it's either now or during the coffee break. We can have 1 minute here. Questions for the panelists? It's coffee time, right, isn't it? So thank you again, all of you. A round of applause again for the panelists. That one was here too. Doesn't turn off. Just leave it. How's it going?
Good. How are you? Check that. Oh yeah, a lot of people have.
Yeah, but there's any place to different.
I don't know. I don't have the answer to that.
How are your elections going? Nominations? How many did you get?
10.
Yeah, which is good.
Yeah, we didn't have to run an election. We got slightly fewer nominations than we had open spots, which is fine. So it's a good tool.
That's good. How many bronze men?
I think we had 3 open slots. Yeah, I think we have a little less than 30. So it's like 1 for every.
I'm sending out tonight again for the bronze because we just got 2 nominations for the bronze for the associates. Now we apply for it.
Yeah. So I will double check just to make sure that we got enough. But
there. So I had an email from Carol yesterday.
From Carol.
I don't know if she's talked to you about this. So she was under the impression that you were elected to the steering committee. Her name was on a vote.
Oh, yes.
Did she mention that? But
So
actually,
she sent me an email saying, are you receiving the steering committee? And I said, no, because I'm not in the steering committee. And I'm in the program committee of the conference.
Yeah. I think Carol misunderstood this because she did put you forward in the last vote.
Oh.
Because I think she's getting to a point where she would let someone else. But there were several members, or several proposed new members, and the vote is someone else from this. So I just thought I'd clarify that.
Oh yeah, no, of course no.
Greg, I mean, I emailed Carol.
Yeah, no, it's not a problem for me.
Yeah.
I mean, it was fantastic to be part of the program committee. I've never thought about the steering committee, to be honest. I mean, I knew I wasn't there. So.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to check in case there was some confusion.
No, not in my mind, at least.
But I would suggest that, because we will, so the way it works is that we'll have a review now of who's going to continue and who's stepping down, and then there will be a new election process. So I told her that she should go with.
Okay, I'm always.
What we've talked about though is whether we should have, because we're using the Eurospace example, which is valuable to us. So we were wondering whether we ought to have some sort of MOU with you guys, just to sort of outline that stuff. We have, because we do, here does manage our money, for example. But it's something to come back to, something to deal with right now. I think that might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, to structure the collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, I've got to run. I'm supposed to be talking to you. I just wanted to check in with you.
Thank you. Thank you for double check. I sent you a Slack. I wrote to you on Slack. Okay. So yeah, we received that.
You what?
We received your nomination.
But I don't need to do it.
No, because as a board member.
Okay.
No, because as a board member.
I need that.
You can send it to me or to Christine. And so no, we don't need the official nomination because as a board member for this year, she is not one to nominations. Thank you for that. They asked me to chair another session now, so I have to run. Back for the rodeo. Good luck for your presentation.
screen went blank, and then it went to the lock screen. And so we ended up swapping out the laptop for one of ours.
It shouldn't be,
Yeah.
that's, and I mean that, right, obviously in a couple ways.
There's no other users on here?
No,
No, there's an admin.
It says logged on, but then.
Right,
yeah, it's
yeah,
locked.
it's not.
Yeah. And I tried,
Yeah, standard.
Yeah.
Password 1, 2, 3.
I tried the username.
Yeah, what its
Yeah.
usual tricks. Do we want, I mean,
Can we use one of your
I can,
machines?
like,
We
I
could
can,
use mine.
I've got a laptop here.
Are you going to be referencing it during or taking notes during the session?
No, I was gonna take paper notes, so like, that's okay.
Because we could use my laptop.
We should, there should be
Okay,
an answer for this.
Actually, we could use someone else's. My HDMI dongle has not been
Oh,
the
I don't have
greatest.
an HDMI dongle though. So I wouldn't need an HDMI dongle.
Oh, and you have like USB-C type?
Well, I have, display port.
Oh, so it doesn't have like an HDMI port?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. Because just mine was like, I don't want to do that in a session like this.
Did you say you needed a dongle or? Yeah, this is for.
Oh, for USB-C? Okay, yeah, I can use this with my laptop. My dongle hasn't been working the greatest.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
just make sure you get this back from me.
I will.
We'll see if I was able to get this work better, but it's not. Let's try this. Yeah, do you want to check anything or should we put some slides there? Just one more. I think you can make like the slide portion bigger if you want to fire over.
Check marks moved over, that's fine.
Okay, yeah. PowerPoint messes up some formatting. I think it's mostly minor stuff. I just wanted to make sure it's the Google Slides is moving that stuff.
Is there anything like this? You can do them, but it's kind of difficult.
I don't really know how to do that. How do I?
Are you just trying to make it smaller?
Yeah.
Well, if we can log in the other one, we can easily switch back. If you want to try it. I was just throwing my laptop up here. God, it's quite I exported them like 10 minutes ago.
Not a good one? Okay, well, here's Steve coming. Yeah, I didn't know if that would work or not. It does for some of the machines, but.
I think that made it a little smaller. Is that what you were looking for?
John Dunn.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Hier feature after feature. Slide number.
Yeah, that's I think so. At the count.
Oh, it's all right. It's fine. I just need to make one.
Sure. I think we're probably fine. I think we're set up and we're going to start here in a few minutes. So that's, yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. I think so.
Yeah, it's just needs to be power cycle.
Okay.
I don't have a lot.
All right, we'll know that for the next one.
All right, we should be good.
Sure. I exported to PowerPoint. I think everything went okay. If you want to double check your slides, feel free. You should be able to cycle them. Like if you want to, might be faster. Oh, what is the?
Okay, looks good.
Yeah, I did make sure nothing looked terribly broken, so I think you're okay. It just some folks were using speaker notes, so works better in PowerPoint than Google Slides.
I did have some speaker notes, but it was not that. It was just
okay. Well,
they'll show. Do the slides.
Yeah, they'll show up there, which should be good. Whenever you're up talking to, just like I know some folks prefer bigger slides or bigger speaker notes. Like you can drag the bar in the middle here if you need to make the slides or the notes bigger. So I saw some folks earlier struggling up here, like, looking at the slides. So if you're doing that, like just make them bigger.
Can I just walk out? Yeah. The stage to see.
Yeah. Well, I saw a few times where people were like leaning over to look at these screens because they couldn't see on the laptop. I was like, okay, if we can avoid that, that would be fantastic.
People down there.
Let me. Do you want to? I'm just gonna plug in too, so this thing doesn't die on you while you're talking. I think there's lots of power, but wait.
Sit down.
Sorry, how do you? Oh, you just drag that bit there, don't you?
Yeah, if you want to go.
All good. All good.
Somebody knows the slide order.
I know I'm first.
Yeah. John is going to introduce the topic, and I think as you stand up, you can introduce yourself to 17 people. Will probably forget it. Just introduce yourself. Just got to make sure there's sufficient power.
Do we know what the video completed?
I just meant.
You'll be the one.
Sure, I'm not.
Okay, go.
Oh, yeah, and this has come up too, but just make sure you're speaking into the mic. Not just the audience, but for the screen. We can change the slide over. Maybe you're speaking kind of later in this panel. We're all live on the air. Well, so yeah, so here's the deal. Ideally, I'm going to talk to you about 8 minutes or so. If you go over, it just be less time. So, does anyone feel like you need good? Do you want like John to tell you that it's helpful? Yeah. Okay.
So what time do you want me to?
So like 8 minutes is the target. So maybe if you could give folks like is there like a 2 minute or a 1 minute or? Yeah. So maybe like a 2 minute and a 30 seconds, I guess. Yeah. So John's gonna hold up like a 2 minute sign with 6 minutes. 2 minute warning and then like a 30 second. Can you see me? Yeah, we're good to Kaylee.
Yeah, Kaylee will come around.
Go over here a little bit.
Yeah.
We're all just dive tapping off the stage. That may be more or less effective. Sorry.
I'm kind of excited.
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Hope you've had a good conference. I know I have. My name is John Dunn from Indiana University, and I am especially excited to be chairing this session, which has become one of my favorite sessions at OR, and I think a crowd favorite as well, and that's the Repository Rodeo, or in this case, the Repository Rodeo Returns. And we have some continuing members of the rodeo. Some happy to have Invenio coming back, I think after being gone last year, and now we have Dataverse as well added to the panel. So I think this is really going to be interesting. I should mention that the origin, I think this is the third year of the Repository Rodeo, and the origin of this session is really that resulting from feedback we got after OR 2015 in Indianapolis from both kind of newcomers to the repository community as well as those who may be working with a particular product or in a particular community who wanted to be able to get an overview of kind of what's going on with all of the products and communities in this space and see what's new. So it's a really, I think, great format and great opportunity for both newcomers and those of us who've been in the community a while. So I don't have any good rodeo metaphors, unfortunately, to kick things off. Hopefully no one will get bucked off the stage, and we won't need to bring out the rodeo clowns partway through. But anyway, with that, I will turn it over to the panel. The format here is each panelist will speak for about 8 minutes on their product and or community, and then we should have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers from the audience. So with that, I'll turn things over to Maureen Walsh, who's going to talk about DSpace, and each of the panelists will introduce themselves. So thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? If at any time you can't, just raise your hand or send a rodeo clown. So as John mentioned, we do have a number of panelists, and each will introduce themselves. I am here to talk about DSpace. I am currently a member of the DSpace steering group, and I am also the chair of DCAT, which is the DSpace Community Advisory Team. DSpace is a turnkey repository solution. It is highly customizable, and I will say that the community is encouraged to contribute back to the code. There are a number of active integrations and plugins, but out of the box, DSpace does cover the IR use case and stays up to date with best practices. For example, SWORD, OpenAir, AIP Backup and Restore, ORCIDs, DOIs, and much more. Just a few statistics about DSpace. There are over 2,000 known instances of DSpace. It is used all over the world in over 120 countries in over 20 languages. DSpace currently has 14 registered service providers in 11 different countries. And we do have annual software releases. You'll hear a little bit more about DSpace 7, but we are going to get back to major releases every year, but we always have minor releases every year. A few things about the community. We do have a defined governance structure. We are currently beginning our elections for the leadership group in the next coming month. And as I mentioned, I'm the chair of DCAT. DSpace Community Advisory Team is a non-technical group. It's an interest group for repository managers where we make recommendations to committers, we make recommendations to the leadership group, to the steering group, and it's a way for people that are using DSpace or are thinking about using DSpace to share best practices and knowledge. And we do have an open Zoom meeting once a month that you're welcome to join. We currently have over 58 members of DSpace. And with the last major release of DSpace 6, we had 74 code contributors. Our mailing list is very active. We currently have over 3,400 members. That community list is over 1,700, tech is 1,284, and development list is 417. We also have a number of Slack channels. Our main Slack channel has 201 members, and that is becoming more popular. Look for our DSpace annual report coming out later this month or next. And there are a few international workshops and user groups I'd like to bring to your attention. There will be one in Peru in July, one in Germany in September, and the next North American user group is scheduled for early 2019, so look for more information about that. Version 7. So DSpace 7, the timeline is early 2019. And following the community-supported strategic plan and community-supported technical roadmap, DSpace 7 has the following goals. A single, out-of-the-box UI. If you're familiar with DSpace or use it, you know that currently there are two UIs, an XML UI and JSP UI. Version 7 will only have one out-of-the-box UI, and that is built on Angular. To support the Angular UI, the existing REST API will be replaced with a new fully featured REST API. And entity configurations will be available out of the box, and I'll say a few more words about that in the next slides. One of the goals is to align with next generation repository recommendations, and all of this will be built on the existing back end. So two of the core recommendations of the 2017 Next Generation Repositories report are coming to DSpace 7. One is resource sync, and a specification for discovery and synchronization of content and metadata, and signposting, an approach for embedding machine discoverable links and relationships in HTML of scholarly repositories. So about configurable entities, this will be very different for DSpace. It is to better align with the next generation repositories and the newest version of OpenAir. We do have a DSpace entities working group. It started in 2017. If you're interested in that, there's a link that when we share the slides. But so entities will allow for configurable new object types in DSpace. So items, the primary DSpace object, essentially become configurable and can have defined relationships. The goals of the working group were to allow DSpace to support new object types and relationships, to align with next generation repositories, and to align with OpenAir version 4. And all of this work was inspired by DSpace Chris. So with configurable entities, plugins can create and define their own entities. And this opens up new use cases for DSpace. So we will be able to support compound objects. If you're interested in helping the development of DSpace 7, we do have sprints, and this is new for DSpace. The first sprint was very successful. One thing that Tim Donahue wanted me to make sure that I mention is that there are coaches available. So even if you don't have experience with DSpace, you've never done a pull request before, there are coaches available to help you develop and contribute back. So if you're interested, there's a sign up, or if you would like to find out more, you can talk to Tim Donahue. He's in the next room talking about DSpace 7, but you can find him afterwards. If you're not a technical person, you want to help, there is a DSpace 7 outreach group that you can join, also DCAT. And I would like to say that we are community supported and driven. We're funded, developed, and supported by our community. Please contribute code, consider becoming a member, and influence the roadmap, the governance, and future benefits. And I'd like to say thank you to our current 58 members. And if you would like to get involved, there's Slack channels, there's the mailing list, and then there's other options, IRC, Stack Overflow, etc. And thank you very much.
Well, hello there. My name is Will Fyson. I work at ePrint Services in Southampton in the UK. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about ePrints today. Just sort of a quick overview of what ePrints is, how it works a little bit, some of the things that we've been working on recently, and just touch upon some of the challenges we face, I guess, as a sort of community. So to start with, ePrint is it's an open source repository, of course, and it's a repository of persistent managed objects. So typically, traditionally these have been research publications, journals, but I mean, as time goes on, it becomes clear that there's actually a variety of different demands on repositories and different things that we can support. It's open source, like I say, and we have a third-party app store where anyone can come along and make their contributions, which is sort of an interesting way of sort of helping get the community to contribute code to the repository. And so ultimately, ePrints is in a sense it's sort of infinitely customizable. You can do whatever you like with it, really, which is quite nice. So here we've got a diagram of sort of the ePrint structure. I don't really expect you to take it all in, because it's quite detailed there. But running through the middle of the repository, we have this sort of, this repository of persistent managed objects. And as I say, this is quite an abstract idea, and we can represent any type of object or record in the repository. So like I say, traditionally it's journal publications or conference proceedings, but it could be bits of software, it could be tweets, it could be so educational resources. And so these are all underpinned by the usual sort of computer science standards and protocols that you'd expect. And on top of this, we build different services for different stakeholders. So for our researchers, you've got various, obviously just to deposit research, but also to export citations, that sort of thing. You've got services for librarians and repository administrators. We've got stats, reporting, all that sort of thing. And then there's the bits of technology that help to support a sort of federated information environment, things like your OAI, PMH, SWORD, so stuff like that. So it's the full stack turnkey solution. You've got the core of storing data, but also the user interfaces all the way to the top. And it's all customizable, so that's all nice. So as I mentioned, we have something called the ePrints Bazaar. This is our sort of app store where anyone can come along and sort of make a contribution. We check over the things that have been contributed, we check that they're sound and they're not going to blow up your repository or something like that. And it's a really nice way of adding functionality, or sort of separating functionality from the core of the repository. So one example of a sort of an app store, a Bazaar app that is quite useful is a ref compliance checker app. So we use this in the UK as part of the ref process, where universities have to report the work that they've been doing to the funders to justify funding, and the works that they submit have to be compliant through various different ways. So there's a Bazaar plugin that checks that records are compliant and meet all the criteria. Now, you wouldn't want this baked into the core of the repository because it wouldn't be useful for our users in Australia, for example. So this is a way of really helping repositories customize their software so that it meets sort of local needs. And it also allows many of our many supporting organizations like Altmetric or DataSite or Core to add their contributions and integrate with the repository. So just to touch upon the history of ePrints ever so briefly, we've been around for nearly 20 years now, so it's quite a long time. And there are 655 repositories recorded in RAW, but we think there are many more out there that just aren't recorded because we occasionally sort of hear from people say, oh, you know, we want a bit of help with your repository. And we're like, oh, never heard of you before, which is always interesting. ePrint Services supports the community at large. We provide sort of hosted support and training and development. But we also try to develop the ePrints core and support the community in what it's trying to do. And whilst our strongest community presence is in the UK, we also have quite a sort of strong German language speaking user group based in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and a number of users in Australia and in North America. So the latest version of ePrints is ePrints 3.4. This is out now. And our aim with 3.4 is that recognizing that repositories that can be used in all these variety of different contexts. And we don't want lots of forking versions of ePrints where the code base becomes a bit unwieldy. So the idea has been to sort of consolidate all the core bits of ePrints onto sort of this sort of fundamental sort of core where different flavors of ePrints that can sort of support different use cases can be built on top of this. And what's nice about this is that developments in one flavor can be if developed appropriately, can sort of be used in another flavor. So we're sort of separating the use cases, but keeping a sort of sustainable core code base. So that's the aim of 3.4. And so I mentioned this idea of flavors. We've got a lot of different ePrints flavors now. So we have sort of the 0 flavor, which is your really super simple repository that is sort of customizable. And you can sort of configure however you like. We've got our publication flavor. That's very much your traditional ePrints experience of journal publications and conference proceedings, that sort of thing. We have a data flavor for storing research data. So this has got lots of sort of configuration of research data. Education, this is also goes by the name of EdShare. This is for sharing educational resources, things like lecture materials or sort of MOOC materials, for example. Social media flavor, this is a bit different, this one. This is for harvesting social media data, things like tweets. So it's sort of used during the research process. And things like impact for non-academic impact, things like economic impact, society, influence on policy, doing outreach, that sort of thing. And a hub flavor which brings content from lots of different repositories together in a sort of federated system. So just to touch upon a couple of recent development highlights, I've been working on something called ePrints Lists. This just allows users to gather together a list of records, either manually or automatically. And it sounds quite simple, but it's actually quite a powerful feature because it allows people to build things like overlay journals on their repositories, or you could create a little MOOC course and you can describe them using sort of rich text and style them completely differently from the rest of the repository, which is something that I'm quite pleased with because I think it's nice to be able to sort of, you could have something that is separate from the repository but built on the same bit of infrastructure. We also have ORCID plugins. I think these were discussed yesterday in the ORCID presentation. But they allow for full integration with the ORCID member API. You can export and import from your ORCID and connect to your ORCID accounts. We've got some visualizations for showing the data in new ways to explore. There's a little sort of author collaboration graph you might be able to see there, very small screenshot. So I'll sort of race through those development highlights because I'm sort of running out of time. But I just want to touch upon a few challenges that we've noticed in the ePrints community, namely the challenges of sort of running a bit of open source software where we've got our customers who support us and sort of how to prioritize their requirements as opposed to the requirements of the community at large, and also the challenges faced by things like CRISs, where you've got the library office competing with the research office and all that sort of thing. So it's an exciting time. Thank you very much for listening. And we've got a stand over there in the next room, so come and chat if you've got any more questions. Thanks very much.
Well, howdy, y'all. That's my rodeo introduction and also my Bozeman introduction. Hasn't it been really fun to be in Montana in the Big Sky Country this week? My name is Esty Pope, and I work at a liberal arts college in Massachusetts called Amherst College. And I am a member of the Fedora Leadership Group as well as the steering group. And I've only been doing this for about a year. So I think what I'm hopefully going to demonstrate is that it doesn't take long to get up to speed on the Fedora community. And Fedora is an open source repository software that, like some of the others that have been mentioned, I wouldn't call it a long history because it's all in perspective, but Fedora is mature. And I actually was thinking about one of our developers who repairs antique refrigerators, that in some ways I can see some relationship, that we have a system that's been around for a long time that was based on a concept, which is that it's flexible, extensible, durable object repository architecture, not the Fedora hat, although you can wear a Fedora hat if you want. But that was a concept that I think still holds true, but just like everything, it needs to be updated and modernized. So just like one of our developers is adding LED lights and potentially a kegerator to old refrigerators, we are in the midst with Fedora community of making some updates and changes to improve and be able to speak to the modern web. So in addition to being a concept, Fedora is also an implementation. So you can actually go to the website right now and download the software and begin using it. It's not necessarily something you could do without developers per se, but it's definitely something that we have a base implementation that's available. And I think another large piece of Fedora, which is something I've been having the pleasure to discover in the last year, is that it's based on a really large, diverse community that is growing and reflecting on how to maintain good community relationships. And that's, I think, what makes it have the longevity that it does, is that people care about it. Thinking about the keynote when we first arrived, that there's a lot of, I don't know if I'd use the word love. Maybe it's like a family member in some ways, that you have good things and bad things that you just can't let it go. And so just to tell you a little bit more about Fedora, for those of you who don't know what it is, it stores, preserves, and provides access to digital objects. It supports flexible and complex content models for those objects. And it also supports complex semantic relationships using RDF. It also will support millions of objects, small and large, and it will interoperate with other applications and services. And I think the question of why to use Fedora, well, hopefully the fact that there is a community and that it is open source software for this population is hopefully a starting point of saying, yeah, that sounds like it fits some of our use criteria. I think one of the other reasons people might use it is because it's flexible, because it can handle a variety of different use cases. And as you'll see with the development work we're doing right now, we're really trying to encourage flexibility in the current iterations of the software. It's durable. It supports long-term preservation. It's not a preservation solution on its own, but it's definitely mindful of that. And in our leadership discussions about strategic visioning, we've really been trying to articulate what this means at the software level. And it powers successful digital repository and DAM applications. And it's also standards-based, and this is something with our Fedora API, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's really important to us that we're not just doing something that's unique to our community. It's something that people outside of the GLAM world, libraries and museums, will be able to speak to, and I think that's really important for being something on the web in our modern society. And again, thriving community. Another important feature of Fedora, or not a feature, but an aspect, is that it's middleware. It's not really something that you would just make available. You need some kind of custom framework or a kind of a interaction layer for either for a management, as a management tool for staff in an institution, or for your end users to use. And two of our best friends in this community who are up here at the table are Samvera and Islandora. Many of us participate in one or more of those communities as well, and we've been making efforts to make sure that our communication flows go back and forth so that what we're doing in Fedora is also something that it's going to continue to make sure that we work well with Samvera and Islandora. But you don't have to use either of those. There are plenty of people who have built custom implementations on top of that. And we're also really excited to continue learning more about the different things people are doing with their custom frameworks. Fedora has also been involved in a lot of the conversations that are happening in the kind of open scholarship and open science space. Our product manager, David Wilcox, who's in the audience, and you probably have all seen him talk at least once at the conference. He participates in a lot of events, making sure that Fedora is listening and paying attention to what's happening in the larger ecosystem. And he recently participated in a working group with the Research Data Alliance, RDA. And just recently, Fedora, DuraSpace, our parent nonprofit organization, started a partnership with CORE, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, where they will be working together going into the future. And we're really excited about this and the work that's being done there. I think it's really going to help us inform the decisions we're making about how our software is set up. I think another key thing is that we, for the Sustaining Open Conference, it's really important to us. These are 4 core ideas that we've been puzzling over in the leadership group about strengthening the ties to other communities, minimizing the amount of code it's required to operate Fedora, and maintaining strong membership support, and also maintaining our active governance group. And like I said before, one of the key things we're working on right now and hoping to finish up this year, and we'll have a specification, our Fedora specification completed, which has 5 main components, which are based on web standards, linked data platform, Memento, web access control, activity streams, and HTTP headers. So that's really exciting work, and it's been a lot of work. But we're nearing completion, and you'll be hearing more about that in the coming months as we finish up 2 sprints and then release a piece of software. DuraSpace, like I said, it's managed by, or Fedora is managed by DuraSpace. It's funded entirely by the community, and it's developed entirely by the community in a collaborative fashion. And there are 2 full-time staff members who are not developers who support Fedora. And here's our beautiful spectrum slide of all the institutions that are affiliated with Fedora. It's a very wide variety, but we are also really hoping we can continue to increase the diversity and voices that are heard in the community, representing all different use cases. The community consists of 400 plus public sites, over 1,000 mailing list members, 74 member institutions, and 25 active developers. And we usually have about 14 workshops and 2 training camps annually. So if you're interested in learning more, we have a website, we have a variety of communication channels, and David Wilcox would be a great person to speak to learn more. He's here today, and I'm sure you can find his information on the website. Well, thank you very much for listening, and hand it over to Sandra.
Okay, if I'm not connecting with the microphone, let me know. So I'm hopeful that this is one of the last conferences that we have to have this kind of slide. So we're the community formerly known as. And I think one of the challenges of the old name is that we used it for the community and the software and particular pieces of the software and all sorts of things. So as we move forward, Samvera is really the name of the community of practice built around a variety of things. And it's nice that we follow Fedora because really the community grew out of a number of institutions who had built custom solutions, custom access solutions on top of Fedora repositories. And as things happen, those institutions lost their funding or had shifts in priorities or lost key developers and found that they didn't have the resources to sustain that common access or that custom access interface. And in speaking with one another said, gee, we're solving many of the same problems over and over. Isn't there a way perhaps that we can share and leverage resources? And that's really where the community and the code both came out of, is finding a set of common practice around providing front ends to that Fedora repository to do a variety of things. ETDs, books and articles, images, GIS data, scholarship and other kinds of documents, manuscripts. There are folks doing all of those things in Samvera-based software solutions. And we'll look a little more at who those people are in a few minutes. What this really was a desire to build a set of common tooling around that Fedora backend, and then out of that decision to adopt a series of other open source tools. So the one that actually isn't shown in this deck that should have been, I realize after the fact, is Blacklight, because that was another sort of important piece here. And that really drove our decisions to become a Ruby on Rails community. There was a tool called Blacklight that existed, that was a Ruby on Rails engine, and that got incorporated. And so Blacklight, Fedora, and Solar gave the core of the community code base that we still deal with today. I won't go too far into the technical details, but come over to the table and talk to Tom and I if you want to know more about how everything fits together. But to reiterate the different kinds of things that different kinds of institutions are doing, there are institutions doing GIS, there's institutions doing special collections, there's a variety of institutions doing IR and ETD type applications. And I'll say this again later in the slides, but when people come to me asking about what can I do with Samvera, or I have this and can I put my content into a Samvera repository, I encourage people routinely to go reach out to the Samvera community email list and say, I have a collection like this. Is there anybody else who's doing this? And the answer is almost universally yes. There's almost always someone in the community doing something like what you're doing. And that's both one of the blessings and one of the curses of the community, is that we are very broad and very open. And that has led to a lot of convergence and divergence over the years, hence the name change. And I'll talk about Hyrax and Sophia and some of those other things in a moment. So we're used by a lot of different type of institutions, both academic and cultural heritage, for a lot of different purposes. And so hopefully you see something here that might look like you if you're interested in learning more. But what we realized over time is that the community started out as a very DIY, developer-centric community. And as time went by, one of the main challenges was that that made it hard for a lot of institutions to adopt or even engage with, because it required a fairly high level of technical resource in your institution. So over time, the community has been focusing on building solutions and solution bundles that let institutions get up and running with a Samvera-based repository faster. So you've probably heard about Avalon, which is the longest standing one here, which has an active community around it of adopters, which is a repository solution focused on media and media delivery. Haiku, which both Haiku and Hyrax come out of the Hydra in a Box project, which just completed last year. And I'll talk a little bit more about both of those. But both of those are designed to provide general purpose repositories that you can get up and running in a lot less effort than it previously took to understand all of the technical underpinnings. Again, the community is really about building a community of practice around all of these things. So this is the attendees of, I think this was the last Hydra Connect, and just the first Samvera Connect in October 2016. But this is both adopters and partners. A key part of the community are the partners. These are institutions that have formally committed at an institutional level by going through the rigmarole of having their university library and usually legal departments sign off a formal letter of, we're committed to sustaining and supporting this project by the contribution of resources, time, effort, people. So these are institutions that have formally actually signed and said, we'll support the project. This doesn't count all of the adopters and other contributors out there in the world. Geographically, we're somewhat North American centric at this point in time, but we have adopters throughout the world. and I'm gonna speed up because I wasn't paying attention to time at all. I think one of the things I want to say is, to this community practice, one of the things we haven't been doing well is talking about naming. Oh, okay. I'll slow down just a bit then. Well, I'll go back to overall, because I'm going to talk very specifically about one of our GitHub repos. So we have a number of code modules and other things. So this is a union snapshot of all of those. So we have 64 different institutions contributing, and in those 280 licensed contributors, which means that we have clear open source code that we can share with the world. You can dig into GitHub, into our repos more and find out more about that. But one of the stories that we haven't told well, I think, is we keep coming up with new names for things. But in point of fact, this new thing, Hyrax, that just came out last year, actually is a continuous history since 2011 of code evolution and development and insights and feedback from the community into the thing that it is today. And that thing that started in 2011 had 5 years of community insight before it. So you'll hear a lot of churn, and that's part of our being an open community. But one of the things I want to call out is that all of that churn is actually good ideas coming and being tested against different institutions, and I think that's one of the real strengths here is that I represent data curation experts, one of the vendors in the community. I sit on the steering group, but the output of this software is really multi-institutional. If you're interested, you can go to our wiki and our website and see all of the different interest and working groups that are going on in the community and plug in there. So those are at the level of technical design, those are at the level of accessibility, topical special interest groups. And I think one of the key things to call out at the end is some of the, we are an evolving community. So one of the things that's just happened is we've just released our second annual report. And we've also just adopted a series of government's recommendations to evolve our community governance. So there are links in the slide deck for both of those. If you want to find out more, there's links in the slide deck for that. So thank you so much.
Hi everybody, I am Mark Jordan from Simon Fraser University and here representing the Islandora community and product. Islandora is a digital assets management framework built on Fedora Commons using Drupal as its front-end business logic, business layer and kind of user interface. Also uses Solar, and the whole stack is smothered in delicious, awesome sauce. And this is an homage, this hamburger logo is an homage to kind of an iconography you may have seen in earlier rodeos where the current Islandora is represented as a large cheeseburger with various components in there. But I'm paying an homage to it and not using it because we're at a transitional point in the Islandora community, transitioning between what we currently know as the 7X stack that is using Drupal 7 as the front end and the next generation, codenamed Claw. When Claw replaces 7X, when it becomes the current Islandora, the Claw, we won't use the word Claw anymore, it'll be just called Islandora, but the Claw is the code name for now. And it's a very interesting time to be involved with Islandora because of this transition. We are fully committed as a community to supporting the current implementation and probably will be so for the next so many years. The defining, I think, criteria for when we will need to consider the current stack to be not viable is the end of life for Drupal 7. And that's kind of beyond our control. It's also a good example of we're using another component. That community's timeline and priorities have a direct impact on another community's. Claw uses Drupal 8 and Fedora 4. Current stack uses Drupal 7 and Fedora 3.8. We've got about 200 instances around the globe. This is a map just representing that visually and probably is a little bit out of date. The only continent we don't have any representation in is really Africa, I think. Again, like Samvera, we're kind of North American centric. The community is an important part of Islandora, and some of you may have heard me speak half an hour ago or more, or an hour ago in the next room on sustainability factors and issues within that community. And I'm proud to be part of it. We have very active email discussion groups. There's always someone on IRC. We use Jira and GitHub for kind of the software-oriented kind of operations. We have a foundation that's managed by a board. Within that foundation, there are more kind of formal groups, a coordinating committee, which kind of does a lot of operational things, a technical advisory group, which advises our tech lead, Danny Lamb, and a committers group, who are the software developers who fix bugs and add features as time goes on. We also have a thriving ecosystem of interest groups. Some of them very active, some not so active, some current, some in hiatus, some coming out of hiatus to do more things. Very active set of groups. We have camps, 2 a year, typically one in North America and one in Europe. There's one coming up very soon in Limerick, Ireland, and one coming up in July in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And we have had 2 conferences every 2 years, one in 15 and one in 17. And a community is made up of individuals. It may have a formal structure, but it is definitely made up of individuals. And some would say they're employers who pay for them to be part of the community. But I want to give a shout out to all the individuals in the community who kind of make things happen. So much other content these days, advertisements just pop up, and here's one in my presentation. If you want to come to a camp and you're in North America, please consider signing up for the Islandora camp in Halifax, which is coming up in July. For those of you from the US, your dollar goes a long way in Canada, so this is a good opportunity to save a little bit of money on an Islandora camp. So the foundation I mentioned a minute ago is a not-for-profit, Canadian registered not-for-profit foundation. We have a board. We have a bunch of other groups, which I mentioned a minute ago. And the foundation is tasked with stewarding the code and making sure the community thrives and is sustainable. Like we've seen before with other communities represented here, here's a board showing some of our supporters. There are 3 tiers of membership in the board, one at $10,000 Canadian, one at $4,000, and one at $2,000. And our latest member is the Islandora Collaboration Group, so thank you very much for joining most recently. I also want to point out that this is a bit out of date. On here is not Leiden University, who's also a member, and thanks very much for pointing that out to me in the earlier session, and I apologize deeply for that omission. So we have 2 releases currently of the 7X stack, one in the spring and one in the fall. The current spring one is a bit late, not a big deal. We worked through it as a community. But what is really gratifying about this process is not only to make our software better, but to focus the community on this process and celebrate what we can accomplish as a community. We have over 40 people who are involved with each release. And I want to just point out that this is 40 people who do not work for the same organization. This is a real testament to how a group of people who don't report to the same boss can come together and get something done on a reasonable timeline. And I want to thank everyone who's involved. And what you see at the bottom are some of the awesome t-shirts that Melissa Anez, our community manager and project manager, who usually gives the repository rodeo for Islandora, has designed. I think she designed all those t-shirts, maybe with one exception. So moving on to CLAW for a second, for more than a second, for more like 2 minutes. There's in the current stack, we have Islandora, so we have Drupal and we have Fedora Commons. And really, in Drupal, Islandora objects, that is the objects that are persisted in Fedora, do not really exist in Drupal at all. Drupal is just kind of like a wrapper around them. We do use a lot of Drupal infrastructure, theming, views, authentication, all that good stuff that you wouldn't want to reinvent. But Islandora objects are kind of really Fedora objects that just show up in Drupal. With CLAW, we're pivoting much in a different direction. We're letting Drupal be Drupal and Fedora be Fedora. That means that Fedora is still a persistence layer and a service layer. We do things like fixity checking through Fedora 4. But the primary place for an object is not in Fedora, it is in Drupal. Fedora is the preservation master, for example. That's where it's curated. This means that for us, we can use many more off-the-shelf Drupal solutions to common problems, many more, instead of reinventing a huge code base to solve the same problems with Fedora objects that the Drupal community has solved many years ago. Drastic decrease in custom code. It's really now more a function of configuration over code and much more increased flexibility. In this new model, Fedora will be a Drupal file system, one of several possible ones. Local file systems, Fedora will simply be showing up as a Drupal file system and will be much more integrated in that way. And best of all, we get to leverage both Drupal 8's and Fedora 4's built-in linked data capabilities. This is a technical overview of Claw, but I'm going to run out of time, so I won't go over it. But the big difference between this and the current version is that Claw is designed from the get-go to be horizontally scalable and Dockerizable, whereas the current stack is kind of doesn't do that very well. I'm just going to point out two instances of Claw before I leave you. One is the University of Toronto Scarborough's Dragonman's site, which you've probably seen yesterday. Marcus Barnes and one of his colleagues gave that talk yesterday. And the other one is from the University of Prince Edward Island. This one is notable because it has been migrated from a Islandora running Drupal 6 to Claw through Drupal 8's migrations framework. So it's a big achievement for UPEI to do that. And thank you very much.
Okay, hello. My name is Lars Horn Nielsen. I'm coming from CERN, and I'm the Invenio product manager. And I am very excited to announce that Invenio version 3 has just been released. It's more than 2 years of development that's been in this. And if you didn't see me at the conference dinner last night, you might know why now. So Invenio is what we say is an open source framework for large-scale digital repositories. And two things that I really want to focus on is now a framework. So if you have known Invenio version 1, then Invenio version 3 is really a radical departure from a repository solution. It's a set of modules and bundles that allows you to build your own data repository. So it's a bit like a Swiss Army knife of battle-tested modules. Also, it's been born since it's only 2 years old. It's really been born for the web. Everything has REST APIs. The internal data storage is fully JSON, described by JSON schema. We can link records together via JSON ref standards. And that doesn't mean you can't store other kind of data models like Dublin Core or MARC or something like that. It just means that the internal storage is in JSON. And this really allows us to use some of the best open source product out there. I will get back to. Then the other thing that we've really been focusing on Invenio version 3 is also the safety and security of the system. Repositories are constantly exposed on the web nowadays, so that's really been a high priority for us that we could deliver a safe and secure system as well. So the reason why we decided to change Invenio into a framework was because we saw the Invenio version 1 was launched in 2002, so it was really aging, and we saw that we had to run more than 10 digital repositories at CERN, and all of them had very different requirements. So one was an aggregator, another research data repository, and it was really hard to actually take the same product and then adapt it to what you wanted it. So what we have done with Invenio version 3 is really build a core of things that a modern digital repository needs. So we have all the bells and whistles, account management, role-based access control, things like that. But really focusing on allowing you to mix match it the way you want it so you can produce your use cases. Then I said Invenio is for large scale. And when I mean large scale, we had designed Invenio version 3 to handle upwards of 100 million records, petabytes of files, and really make it fast, okay? This is the future I think we're looking at with research data management, for instance. And we can do that simply by, the way we are able to do this is simply leveraging existing open source technologies out there that are already handling this. We are fully built on, so we have backend database like PostgreSQL or MySQL, but these are actually just the safe data storage. They provide the rock solid, reliable data store for the thing, but any kind of querying goes to Elasticsearch. And Elasticsearch is already at CERN, for instance, handling logging infrastructure where we are piping in terabytes of data every day. Okay, Elasticsearch is a rock solid search product, and it fits well together in this JSON world where we can store JSON in the database and then index it in Elasticsearch. Invenio is built on Python and the Flask web development framework. So that also means we can leverage a lot of all the existing modules out there that is already built for Python and for Flask. And even though Invenio version 3 just got released, then it's already been running for 1.5 years now in production systems. And these production system is, for instance, Zenodo, where we are handling some 2 million records, 60 terabytes of data. We have a CERN videos encoding platform, where we essentially all videos launched from CERN goes into this archive. They have transcoding, webcast, things like that built into the system. We have the CERN Open Data Portal, where we now have 1.7 petabytes of research data from LHC being shared via this platform. So we've really been testing Invenio version 3 before releasing it. So it doesn't mean that the system, just having it released now doesn't mean the system isn't mature. Also, there's already other people building on Invenio. So for instance, we have the Japanese National Institute of Informatics. They're building VECO 3. It's a repository platform for more than 500 Japanese universities. We also have the Inspire high energy physics aggregator, which is then basically the discovery system for high energy physics. We also have the Swiss Library Network building an integrated library system on top of Invenio, and it just shows some of the very different use cases that you can actually get Invenio to do for you. And it's all based on this same core of strong record management with JSON and strong file management. We've also just launched a new, nice new website with a public roadmap, so you can follow what are actually the core, the primary things we're looking to. The way Invenio is being developed is right now primarily at CERN. We're still looking for partners, but we've focused on delivering a core solid product first. But we're already collaborating with something like the National Institute of Informatics in Japan in delivering features. And we're happy to, if somebody wants to join in, we're happy to provide free support and get you up to speed fast on Invenio. We have more than 20 developers at CERN working with Invenio, developing for Invenio. And it's all a team that has something like 20 years of experience in building these digital repositories. So the future that we're looking at for Invenio is, like most of the other repository platforms, is supporting the next generation, the core next generation repositories. It's not the only thing though, it's also the data citation roadmap for scholarly data repositories. And we're gonna have an Invenio user group workshop coming up in 2019. So if you wanna learn more about it, there will be training possibilities at this user group workshop as well. And last but not least, don't forget to collect your hex stickers, which is out at the table here. Thank you very much.
Everybody hear me okay? All right, great. My name is Danny Brook. I'm the Dataverse Development Project Manager. There we go. I want to tell you a little bit about the Dataverse project. I don't know if some of you were in the immediately previous session in here, but we talked about the Dataverse community a bit. I'm going to talk about the software, talk about some of the stuff that we have going on, talk about the community. Obligatory map slide. We have 33 installations worldwide. These installations are focused on, some are focused on a specific geographic area, like a country. Others are focused on a specific research community, like structural biologists. Others, like the Harvard Dataverse, are open to all researchers worldwide that have data to deposit. Our primary focus is data. Really, the core of what we do in Dataverse is centered around this, which is our data set page. We consider a data set the files and then the metadata that supports that. We follow the FAIR principles. The reason I'm showing you this is to just not only illustrate that we do follow the FAIR principles, and to give you kind of a sense of what our data set pages look like in Dataverse, but also because I'll be coming back to this Dataverse page or this data set page a little bit later in the presentation. So you can see from here, our big thing is the citation. That's a lot of authors on that one. and we also support files, metadata terms, and we have robust versioning, both minor and major versioning. So what I want to talk to you today about is our most recent release, hot off the presses, what was included in that as a typical release, and I'm going to just talk about some of the issues that were included in there. It's typical in that it was broad, it wasn't very focused, but I'll get to that in just a second. I want to talk about some of the stuff that we do related to computation. So the place where we work, the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University, the mission is bigger, better, faster, and more collaborative social science. So the compute piece is really focused on the faster part of that and getting researchers closer to compute resources, and I'll talk about that in a little bit of detail. I mentioned structural biology as one of the communities that we support, so I'm going to talk about the large data support in terms of that, and then also how that's going to be built back into the product for the larger community beyond just structural biologists, and then talk a little bit about sensitive data support, and that's something that's coming up in our big 5.0 release, and this is something that our community has been asking about for a long time. So as of 4.9, as of Tuesday when this was released, now you actually can have persistent identifiers for files. We support EasyID data site handles. So you have a few different options for PID minting, but we support it at the data set level, and now also the persistent identifiers exist at the file level. So that's something that's exciting, and that goes to the more granular levels of persistent identifiers. We now have provenance integration. You know, if we think about, again, back to the mission, about the better science is reproducible. So in addition to your data, tell us everything you can about the provenance of your data. So now in 4.9, you can actually upload a prov file, or you can provide a free text for your provenance. Metrics and curation APIs, we want to make it easier to run Dataverse. We want to make it easier to maintain from a curation standpoint. And then also the metrics APIs are so people can build reporting dashboards, get information about what's happening in their Dataverse instance. We're moving into internationalization. This is part of our work with Dataverse EU. So we have some initial pull requests there. And then, you know, not so exciting, but very necessary, you know, upgrades of what we're working on. And then 60 some other issues that were led by the community. We have our core team at Harvard, but then the community also builds a lot of stuff as well. So really quickly, I want to talk about two things. If you think back to that data set page, one of the things that we want to do is we want to allow researchers to just compute directly on the application. So the compute button here, is this is available if you stand up your Dataverse using the OpenStack architecture, and so your files will be in Swift, which is the OpenStack storage, and then you can actually compute on those files, and it's much quicker since, you know, the files are already there. So that's a really cool integration, and, you know, it's something that you know, can make science faster. You don't got to pull down the files. You don't have to use them on your desktop. You can do it right in the same place where the data is stored. And then Explore, there are a couple tools that are built to explore. For example, if you upload a shape file, you can do some geospatial exploration and world map. If you upload a tabular file, like a Stata file, and it goes through our ingest process, you can check it out in 2 Ravens if you want to do some deep analysis, or Data Explorer if you just want to take kind of a quick peek at what's in that file and see if it's something that's relevant to you. I mentioned structural biology. We have a structural biologist embedded on our team, and so we now have a greater appreciation. You know, I said we were the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. We now have a much greater appreciation for larger data sets. And so we've worked as part of a grant provided by the Helmsley Charitable Trust. We've worked with structural biologists at the Harvard Medical School to enable data transfer through rsync over SSH. And this, you know, right before we started on this work, we had to move data in and out using APIs or just through a drag and drop interface, and that's not great for large files. So rsync is a really cool opportunity to, you know, to meet this grant's need, to meet structural biologists' need, and then also feed that back to the community. And so again, that's rsync over SSH to support big data transfer. Jumping into sensitive data a little bit. As part of our sensitive data support, we're looking at we're looking at two things. The first being data tags. So I won't go into too much detail because I don't have too much time, but data tags is a way to a way to classify files for handling, and that is both for access requirements and security requirements. So if you want to learn more, definitely check out datatags.org, and we're going to be building this integration into Dataverse as part of our sensitive data support. Differential privacy. This simple, this can explain differential privacy. So I'm not going to go too much into detail about differential privacy, but the general idea is that when we support sensitive data and you're coming in as a researcher, you might not have access to that data. But we want to provide a way that you can do explorations on that data to learn enough to see if you want to go through that IRB process, or you want to go through whatever you need to do to get to that sensitive data. So differential privacy is a way of doing that. And so if you want to learn more, there's some links there, and these slides will go out they'll go out to the go out on the site. So special thanks to the core team at Harvard. We have a community, and we also have a core team that builds Dataverse. The way we sustain our software is through grants and partnerships. And then definitely a big thanks to the community. So we have a very robust community, and there's a lot of different ways to get involved. Really quickly, we are transparent about what we do. Anything we're working on is on our waffle board. You can see what we're writing at any given point in time, down to the individual commits, so check it out. And just with that, thank you. I would like to say this is my first rodeo, as a matter of fact. So I was happy that nobody else made that joke. But if you want to get in touch, definitely reach out, dataverse.org, and then /contact. That's all the different ways to get in touch with us. And if you're in Cambridge next week, come to our community meeting. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks to all of our panelists for those great overviews and updates. So we actually have about 30 minutes now for questions from the audience, discussion with the panel. So let me know, raise your hand if you have a question for all or any of our panel members. No one? Okay, I'll ask one. Oh, okay, saved me.
So just to get things started, maybe each of the panelists could just say what is, for the project that you're representing, what's your favorite thing about the software that you're doing? So more kind of like a feature, and maybe explain why it's your favorite.
A favorite. Is this on? Yes. Oh, we have someone who wants to start.
So my favorite is the one that just got released. So we just released Hyrax 2.1, which has been a major community effort. And the major outcome of that is a much richer set of collection management tools that lets us now both create administratively, but also sort of curatorially faced collections, and in fact gives us the ability to create branded collections within the application, so that we start to have the ability to have individual collections have themes and icons and logos, and that tooling is now built within the application rather than something custom, which is what we've been having to build on in prior years past. So that's a really exciting move forward for the community.
The compute stuff that I just talked about briefly is really exciting. Both being able to jump to a computing environment, and then if you think about the potential work, having kind of the idea of the round trip there, that you jump from data, jump to the compute environment, then deposit the computational result, the provenance, the code, all that stuff back into Dataverse, and just having that all happen, that's something that's really really neat to me.
Well, yeah, for me, it's the version 3 release. It's a huge relief to have it out now. It really allows us. We have another 50 modules in the pipeline that's already done. They're just in the pipeline to get released. So that's been the best thing right now, I think.
So my favorite thing about Claw is that we have kind of a very simplified content model. In the current Islandora, we have modules, like whole sets of code to represent PDF content model, books, newspapers. In Claw, we have kind of one content model with a bunch of Drupal tags that says this is a newspaper. And that kind of made me giggle, like honestly, when I saw that in action. It's just like a, zoop, down to nothing. Awesome.
Well, I think for me, I've been watching somewhat afar from the work on the Fedora specification. We have a developer on our staff, Bethany Seeger, who is sitting in the audience, and she's been heavily involved in some of the sprints and reviewing the code, and it's been a lot of work because there's a lot to do to get it up to speed. But I'm so excited about the web standards that we're using. I'm really excited about linked data. I'm really excited about the potential for what this means for Fedora and for so many institutions, like small ones like ours, where we really want to get our stuff out there. We put a lot of effort into making our Emily Dickinson stuff available to the world, and we really want we want to talk more to the Harvard collection of Emily Dickinson and other people and let people see this stuff. And I think the modern web and the promises of the decentralized web, I guess I'm just a total believer right now, but I'm excited that Fedora is moving in that direction.
I think one of my favorite things about ePrints is that someone once described it as being like the Millennium Falcon. It doesn't look like much, but it gets the job done. So I was always quite chuffed about that. But and I was trying to think what do I like about ePrints, and I was thinking about my presentation just there, and there's sort of a focus I think on the flexibility of ePrints, where often you're tasked to try and achieve something, and you think, well, how the hell am I going to do that? And then it ends up always being easier than you expect almost. And I think it sort of ePrints' long history means that so many things have been done in it already that invariably there's some variation that you can sort of tweak or customize, and you can pull off a new trick or something with it. So it is, I think that's sort of my sort of the thing I like about ePrints really. It's a flexible open source bit of software that is it gets the job done.
I don't think I have one favorite thing about DSpace, but I'll say a few things to maybe cheating a little bit. One of the things that I really appreciate about DSpace is it's just been working for the past 16 years. And it keeps working, and it does what it needs to do, but there's a lot of community engagement and a lot of new features that are developed and new work that's done. And what's really exciting with the work with DSpace 7 is some of that work that has been forked or done elsewhere is coming back to the community, coming back to the code, and I'm really excited about configurable entities. I'm very excited about the new REST API and the new Angular user interface. But what that says to me is that DSpace is continuing to move to support a global community and a global open community with the work with OpenAir, with the bringing the entities from DSpace Chris. So I think we're continuing to move in the direction of supporting open and supporting open globally.
All right, another question. So we'll go here then, over there.
Yeah, thank you. So it's if I may, it's a challenge. So some of you have presented the futures and also the future plans and the recent developments. I would like to have from each of you that you can highlight something that you appreciate from the recent developments or the future plans for from the other software. So you don't need to select from all, but just pick up one that you really appreciate.
Well, since I have the mic, I'll start. I think I appreciate openness with everyone, and I appreciate the community behind each. But I think with Fedora, I really appreciate the standards-based work that they have always done and continue to do.
What I find quite interesting today is everyone's sort of commitment to the core next generation repository stuff. So I'm quite pleased that everyone's committing to that, because I think some of the things in mind, things like resource sync, for example, it requires everyone to get behind it. Otherwise, these sort of technologies don't fulfill the potential that they possibly could. So that's what yeah, I'm quite sort of pleased with today.
Well, I think I was really interested with Invenio, and I have to admit I didn't know very much about it before this conference, because I'm also new to this conference. And I think for me, one thing that I was impressed with, you think about CERN and the amount of data that the Hadron Collider must put out. It's big data, big time. So, you know, just seeing what's happening in the really big data space and how it can inform what's happening in smaller data spaces. And also just what I'm really interested in is that the diversity and having many different people working on these problem spaces. Like, I think it's really healthy for the community that there are, that we're all like, yeah, we're psyched about what we're doing, and we're like paying attention to each other and trying to get a handle on this ecosystem. So.
I think I'm sort of in the same camp of the way that each of the products and communities have engaged a broad base of institutional practitioners and users, especially the folks doing the data science. You know, it's a hard thing to coordinate and corral all the cats in any of these open communities, and the fact that any of us are here sitting after the time that our communities have been around, I think is a testament to each of the communities. So that, and I think particularly, as I say, I'm the same with Invenio and DataCite. The issues in practice around large data sets is something that our community is grappling with, and it's nice to hear some people further along the road that we can maybe steal some ideas from, or at least point some folks to their practice as we get asked some of the tough questions around that.
I'd like to echo what Mark said, but also I think it's really great to see all the platforms represented here to be moving ahead so quickly and becoming much more mature in various ways. It's kind of cool to see that happening. And my sense is that this rodeo, we can say that more uniformly than at other rodeos. That's great to see.
What I'm really impressed about the other platform is the communities that have been built around it and getting things done, because I know how hard it is to get things done just in a closed team. So I'm really impressed what all the other platforms has done. I'm also very excited to see how all the platforms are then signing up behind something like next generation repositories, and we're actually moving ahead and getting it implemented, because I think it's critical in order to build research data management systems that other researchers can build apps on top, that we actually get some common ground that they can build on top, so we don't have to decide to go to Zenodo or Figshare or Dataverse, but we have some common APIs.
Yeah, so just to build on that a little bit, one thing that I was really excited was to see the idea of community sprints presented. When I first started at Dataverse, I came from a product development background where we were open source, but we didn't really have any contributors. So that's good. I mean, you should make your code open so people can inspect it. But when I first came to Dataverse, I said that the open source community is both the best and worst part of my job, because as a project manager and we're sustained by grants, there was sometimes some challenges trying to organize community work, and we've gotten a lot better at it over 2 years and allowing and getting those pull requests merged. But it's really just great to hear different strategies for coordinating open source work, and so it was really neat to see that.
Continuing on that theme, I would love to hear what kinds of cross-community collaborations are going on. I know at University of Virginia, we are members of, if I'm counting correctly, at least 4 communities that are up there, maybe 5. And so at this point of maturation, it would be great to hear of specific collaborations. And obviously the Fedora, Samvera, Islandora collaboration is well known, but I'd love to hear about what's either going on that I don't know about or what's coming up.
Sure. Well, most importantly, I talked with David, and when he comes to Boston, we're going to do a Fedora Dataverse beer. We're going to do a homebrew, so that's the most important thing. So aside from that, so I definitely look at it as, you know, how do we work with other communities, and, you know, like this is the first time at the Open Repositories Conference, but I look at it more as we need to play well with others. We need to be open. We need to make it easy to get data in and out of Dataverse. We need to follow standards to share our metadata around. We need to get on board with things like resource sync. So I don't look at it as much as we collaborate with specific communities and specific pieces of software, but more we just need to, you know, be open. We need to follow standards. We need to make sure that, you know, that we're not only playing well with what's there right now and what's potentially there, but to think in the future how we can play well with the next thing.
It's more or less in the same direction. Again, I don't think we have, you know, we have too much collaboration with others at this point, but we do collaborate on, say, something like the open air guidelines, the next generation repositories, and this is essentially also where I think is the most important task, to coordinate the things. Then we had a workshop here Monday on the SWOT. So that's clearly one thing where we're trying to figure out, can we actually build, for instance, a Python reference implementation that's usable by Invinio, by archive.org, by some of all these other Python repository implementations which are out there, okay?
I can offer a very specific example. We're looking to our colleagues in the Samvera community because they're about 1.5 years ahead of us in moving, 2 years, let's say, in moving to Fedora 4. And one of the areas where you know, Islandora needs to address is moving from XML-based descriptive metadata and other kinds of metadata to more linked data. Or RDF, and so this is kind of a pain point within the Islandora community right now because we all have these kind of crafted mods records that we need to get into RDF in Fedora. And one of the specific examples that I'll offer is the mappings between mods and RDF. Colleagues in the Samvera community have addressed that already to a great extent. So we're looking at their work to help us move into CLAW faster. Yeah.
I have two I want to highlight, one within the community and one the community participating more broadly. The one within the community that is super exciting to me is that in that partner set of institutions that I had a slide up, 7 of those institutions have committed I think 8 people right now at a half-time level for a period of 6 months to 12 months within the Samvera community to build a consistent development team who can sprint together and work on some of the tech debt in our stat, because it's easy to get community members to work on new features and the shiny new things, but going back and cleaning up and making things more stable and solid and easy to use is a slog in an institution and even harder across institutions. So it's really exciting to see the community coming together around that. The other one that I see happening that's really exciting to me is a lot of Samvera community members joining a community called DevOps for Lib, which is focusing on how to bring DevOps practices of bringing development and operations closer together and streamline the pipeline of getting all of our technical work into the hands of the people who are actually using them. And I'm seeing a lot of cross-institutional and cross-project learning come out of that. That's really exciting to me, and I think gonna help all of us experience better things going forward.
I think one of the things that we've been talking about in the leadership group is how to make sure we're keeping our communication flows between some of our constituents, like definitely with Islandora and Samvera, as we make a lot of decisions about the technology and just how we want to do things with Fedora. And one recent change is we've added liaisons to our leadership group, that we have an Islandora liaison and a Samvera liaison who participate in our leadership group calls. And we felt like this was really important because we wanted to both be hearing from those communities more directly at the leadership level, but also for them to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing with that? What are you guys thinking? And be able to offer us some input about what's going on in their communities, so that as we're deciding how to implement something, that we're not suddenly causing a major issue with another community. And likewise, we also want to be out there involved in more communities. And I think one that has been really kind of the major focus right now is being part of the Oxford Common File System process, and thinking not that we are in a position that we want to force anything on those communities, but be able to communicate where we're coming from and be able to say, if you want to work with Fedora, here's some guidelines, or here's where we're thinking. And we're also doing an inventory of other communities that we should be paying attention to. And I would love if you have any thoughts about that, of what Fedora should be looking at. Be happy to get some input directly to me, or I'm sure David would be able to capture that for us, because we are actively trying to make sure that we're reaching out and participating more broadly in conversations.
So as far as collaboration sort of amongst the communities represented on stage is concerned, I sort of once again sort of fall back to the core next generation repository stuff, where like a number of us, I believe, were in a meeting earlier this week to talk about sort of what the priorities are as to what sort of things we should be implementing in our repositories. And as far as sort of collaboration within like the ePrints community is concerned, there seems to be sort of more of an increase in that of late. So, for example, there was the ORCID plugins I mentioned earlier, were a sort of community effort with lots of different people submitting the work that they'd done previously. And this was all sort of corralled by JISC back in the UK. And we've also got sort of new exciting times ahead of us when we've got things like such as the GDPR EU sort of legislation to tackle. Well, we probably should have done it by now, really. And so sort of sharing techniques of how to do and sort of ideas about what to do with that is sort of another sort of area of collaboration of late.
With collaboration, certainly we collaborate on a global scale. We've heard, with CORE, with OpenAir, with RDA, with ORCID, but internally within DuraSpace, and maybe David might want to add something, but I think there has been over the years maybe not as much collaboration between the projects as there could have been. And I think internally they are working with those within DuraSpace to cross-train or work on different projects, not specifically their projects. And I think as a community, we certainly could learn more from each other and talk more with each other. And I think it has been fragmented over the years, not in all cases. And I think that we have room for improvement. So if you have suggestions, would love to hear them. But I think we all are looking outward in the same ecosystem and looking to address that. And I think there are ways that maybe we can, do that in a more together fashion, because we are looking to solve some of the same problems in different ways. So I think we have room for improvement.
All right. Any other questions?
So just thinking about kind of, one of the conference themes has to do with sustainability, and it would be great to hear, maybe just looking out over the next 5 or 10 years, where you all kind of see your projects going in terms of sustainability, whether that's to do with funding or contributions or, business model or however you want to kind of frame that, but just, what does this rodeo look like in 5 years or 10 years in terms of where these projects are at?
Wow. Well, I hope the project is still very globally viable. We are, as a project, looking to reinforce and reinvigorate on the global scale. There are a lot of communities that are using DSpace around the world and maybe not as connected to the project. And Michele is actively working on that. Looking at DSpace internationally and where we can connect better, because there's a lot of great work being done. There's a lot of people that are engaged with DSpace, and how do we bring everything together and move forward together. I think some of the work with DSpace 7 is instrumental in that, in moving forward together. I think that, you know, what we look like in 5 years, hopefully we are still solving the problem of sustaining open, and hopefully we are, you know, with the work we're doing with governance and the work we're doing with membership, you know, we have more work to do, but we are sustaining our membership. We are sustaining our community. However, you know, that's not something you can sit back and say, we have a community, that's great. It's constant work. It's constant, you know, maintaining those relationships, building those relationships. And I think having Michele on board with DuraSpace is going to be a great asset in that.
Yeah, as far as the question of sustainability is concerned, it's a good question. So I think I sort of touched upon this briefly in the in my presentation in regards to sort of, so ePrince's approach is this idea of sort of identifying new areas where repositories might be able to serve some sort of purpose, sort of meet various demands. So we've got like the different flavors, and sort of as academia evolves and perhaps places less of a focus on research publications and begins to recognize that there are different ways of recording academic impact, then repositories perhaps have a role to play there. Sustainability, I guess, also comes from the identifying sort of new sort of, I guess, markets for repositories from different regions around the world, really, which perhaps aren't so well represented at the moment. I think there's also an element of sustainability might depend on how well sort of higher education institutions and funders and organizations such as ourselves cooperate and sort of recognize the need for what we're doing here and sort of continue to fund it, and how sort of priorities between having sort of an open academic research infrastructure, how to prioritize that compared to sort of report on something that sort of serves researchers themselves, as opposed to, say, things, systems which are more for doing sort of research admin and reporting back to funders, so your Chris's and whatnot, which are more from the sort of less about accessibility to research side and more about sort of, yeah, administration. So I think it's important for all stakeholders to have a sort of collaborate, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Sort of waffled a bit towards the end there.
Well, maybe in 5 to 10 years, there will be multiple Fedora implementations represented in the rodeo. And that's one hope with our Fedora 5 implementation. I think one of the dreams of that, and if you've seen, we have about 8 different potential implementations based on the API spec. And I think that is actually a really good kind of self-preservation piece. It's like replicating the system, but also allowing different communities, different use cases to interpret what Fedora is in different ways. So I really hope that we'll have several viable implementations in 5 years that are calling themselves Fedora and perhaps inspired by Fedora to do more things and meet more use cases. And I think that's going to help with our, you know, maintaining a solid community and solid software. And then I think the other topic is really just about engagement. And I think in the Fedora community already, people have come and gone. Things have changed at their institution. They've had more involvement or less involvement, but people come back. And I think that's another thing. I'm hoping that continues, that we can continue to add new people, increase the engagement, and also have people come back and join up in the future. And a lot of that, I think, is that you have to want to do it. And again, I'm still thinking about that, the opening keynote about people really being invested in the fan fiction and that they wanted to contribute. And I hope we can be that kind of thing, that people feel interested and invested in what it's doing for the library, museum, archives, and galleries communities, and beyond, really, too, because that's the other hope of the spec, is that we'll attract other audiences to use this set of tools.
So when you asked about sustainability, my team freaks out when I say this to them, but it's not really about the code, it's about the content that we all steward. And we've been starting to have some really deep conversations about how do we make that content easier to hold and manage over time in the face of technological changes. So it was mentioned that we've already seen the Fedora 3 to Fedora 4 migration within parts of this community, which was a major effort. And I think if we really talk about sustainability and we think about 10 years and 15 and 50 years out, it's really how do we let all of us hold our content in ways that ride the waves of all of the technologies that we're going to see go on underneath us. Fedora 5, new API, those are all exciting, thrilling changes, but they also have lots of labor and management implications for all of us. And so we're starting to ask questions around how do we design our applications and our infrastructures to make that kind of change easier to deal with. And I'm hopeful to see those kinds of conversations continue.
So with regard to the product, Islandora, we'll just continue to adapt to the two main components, Drupal and Fedora Commons, as that happens, and hopefully do that in a way that's inviting and sustainable. As with regard to the community, though, to grow it, I kind of fear a saturation point in 5 years, where any institution that's going to have, any existing institution that's going to have a repository is going to be using one of these products, probably. And unless we cannibalize each other, there's not going to be a lot of growth after 5 years. So there'll be new institutions and all that, but I'm trying to get my head around what happens when we reach peak repository. Yeah.
So for Invenio, I see kind of like two sustainability models. So one is the typical open source one, where you have somebody providing a rock solid core product, and others just stand on the shoulders and are happy knowing nothing about the stuff below. We're doing that ourselves with Flask and Python, for instance. So that's one version where CERN, we're fully committed on Invenio. We have 10 repositories we have to sustain based on previous record. Then we're looking at a lifetime of at least like 10 to 20 years of repositories before we change technology. Then the other sustainability model, continuing this one, then I see that then there will be communities like putting out an Invenio RDM version, an ILS version. There we're already incubating some of it, okay, but it's just they're relying on this solid core. The other one is more along the lines of what you're doing in Fedora as well, is like have a core with multiple contributors to the core and collaborating on that one.
Great. So I'll be brief. Very similar. Focusing on the core, and then making it easier for folks to build integrations or plugins or what they need to do at their particular institutions to meet their needs. And then also, just a few weeks ago, we did initiate the the Global Dataverse Community Consortium, and that we have been basically running this out of the core team at Harvard, and community members have adopted and joined the community. But really, the only way we can sustain and grow is to have that that level of governance from the community instead of just from Harvard. So that's something that's very exciting from a sustainability perspective.
All right, well, we're out of time. I think all of our rodeo contestants today are winners for sure, and wish we had trophy belt buckles for everyone, but especially being here in Montana. But please join me in thanking our panelists. And do not miss the Ideas Challenge session at 1:30 back in this room.